Good evening. Tonight we're settling into something wonderfully strange, wonderfully slow, and wonderfully soft around the edges. The American automobile of the 1970s. A machine built less like a vehicle and more like a floating parlor room that happened to have a windshield. Tonight isn't about speed, and it isn't about precision, because neither of those things were really on offer. Tonight is about comfort, excess, chrome, shag carpet energy, and a decade that decided the answer to almost every automotive question was simply more. Before we ease into it, thank you for spending another quiet evening here. If this is your first time joining, welcome, and if you've been here before, welcome back to the couch. This channel exists so you can close your eyes, let a long, gentle voice carry you somewhere else, and drift off before you even notice the story ending. There's no rush tonight. No urgency. Just a soft lamp, a low hum in the background if you'd like one, and about 3 unhurried hours in the driver's seat of a very large, very confused decade. So dim the lights if you haven't already. Get comfortable. Loosen anything that needs loosening. And let your mind wander back to a time when cars were the size of small apartments, when a dashboard could be upholstered in something that used to be a cow, and when nobody could quite explain why the radio only worked when you hit it in a specific spot. Let's begin with a simple question. What did it actually feel like to be an ordinary person walking into an American car dealership in the middle of the 1970s? Not reading about it later, not looking at old photographs. Actually standing there, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, with a checkbook in your coat pocket, and absolutely no idea what you were about to agree to. Picture the showroom itself first, because the showroom was doing a great deal of quiet psychological work before you ever said a single word to anyone. The floor gleamed. It always gleamed, polished to the kind of shine that made you instinctively walk a little more carefully, as though you might slip and slide directly into a monthly payment plan. Banners hung from the ceiling in patriotic colors, the kind of red, white, and blue you'd expect at a parade rather than a place of commerce. Somewhere, always, a radio played something soft and orchestral, the kind of music engineered to make large sums of money feel like small, easy decisions. And in the middle of it all sat the car. Not parked so much as displayed, the way a painting is displayed, angled just so under the lights, its hood propped open a few inches. Not because anyone expected you to understand what you were looking at underneath, but because an open hood suggested honesty. It suggested nothing to hide. It suggested, somehow, without saying a word, that this machine had been built by careful, thoughtful engineers rather than assembled by an exhausted worker on the Friday afternoon shift who wanted nothing more than to go home. You hadn't even walked through the door yet, and already the room had decided how you were going to feel. Then came the salesman, and every dealership in America seemed to employ some variation of the same man. Let's call ours Walt. Walt wore a jacket in a shade of plaid that existed nowhere else in nature, and a tie so wide it could double as a napkin in an emergency. Walt's handshake arrived before Walt's name did. Walt's smile arrived before Walt's handshake. By the time you'd actually introduced yourself, Walt had already decided which car you were going to buy, and the only remaining mystery was how long it would take you to agree with him. Walt didn't talk about the engine. This was not an oversight. This was strategy. The engine, if discussed honestly, was something of an embarrassment, a lumbering thing that made a great deal of noise while producing a modest amount of forward motion. So Walt steered the conversation, almost literally, toward the ride. He talked about how she floats. He talked about how you'd glide down the highway like your living room had learned to drive itself. He gestured toward the seats the way a man might gesture toward a cathedral, and he invited you to sit. And here is the part that mattered more than anything Walt actually said. The moment you lowered yourself into that seat, something in your judgment simply switched off. The seat was enormous. It was soft in a way that modern seats generally aren't allowed to be anymore, all give and no resistance, like sinking into a very expensive throw pillow. It smelled of fresh vinyl and adhesive and new carpet, a scent that had somehow, through sheer decade-wide agreement, become the smell of success itself. You weren't thinking about miles per gallon anymore. You were thinking about how good you looked sitting there, even though nobody else in the showroom was actually looking at you. Walt knew this. Walt had watched this exact transformation occur on 1,000 faces before yours, and he simply waited, patient as a fisherman, for the line to go tight. Then came the price sheet, and this is where the real performance began. The number printed at the top, the base price, was a kind of beautiful fiction, a number that existed purely to get you sitting in that seat in the first place. From there, the list unfolded like a slow reveal. Air conditioning extra, whitewall tires extra, the upgraded radio extra, tinted glass extra, a vinyl roof to make the car look, in some vague and unexplainable way, more distinguished extra. Undercoating, which Walt promised with total sincerity would stop the rust that was, in fact, already beginning its slow work beneath the paint, extra. Each item on its own sounded so small. A few dollars a month here, a few dollars a month there. You kept nodding because Walt had a way of making every single addition sound like the obviously correct choice for a person of your evident taste and good sense. By the time the pen finally touched the paper, the number had grown by nearly half, and you'd agreed to every bit of it while smiling the entire time, the way a person smiles when they've just been told they have wonderful judgment. Nobody mentioned, of course, that the undercoating wouldn't actually stop the rust. Nobody mentioned that the vinyl roof would trap moisture against the steel underneath it like a slow-acting curse. Nobody mentioned that the mighty engine under that long, gleaming hood produced less power than the much smaller car it had replaced only a few years earlier. None of that mattered in the showroom. In the showroom, there was only the shine of the floor, the softness of the seat, and Walt's hand on your shoulder, gently, warmly, guiding you toward 2 tons of trouble with the confidence of a man who had never once lost a sale to a fact. You drove off the lot that afternoon feeling, for lack of a better word, important. The rust could wait. The gas mileage could wait. Tuesday could wait. Today. You were a person who owned a truly enormous car, and that alone felt like enough. Let's actually look at what you bought, because the first thing anyone noticed about a 1970s American sedan was, without question, its size. This was the full flowering of what people would later call the land yacht era, when a family sedan could stretch past 18 or even 19 feet from bumper to bumper. Parking one of these machines wasn't so much a maneuver as it was a negotiation with the laws of physics. From the driver's seat, you genuinely could not see where the front of the car ended. You aimed it in the general direction you wanted to go, and trusted that the hood would eventually stop existing somewhere out there beyond your vision. It felt less like driving a car and more like piloting a very comfortable, very confused ocean liner that had wandered inland. Consider the actual numbers for a moment, because they are, even now, a little hard to believe. Some of the largest sedans of the decade stretched past 19 feet long and weighed well over 2 tons, heavier than a small elephant, longer than many modern pickup trucks. This was not a car you drove. This was a small structure you relocated from one place to another, slid it into a standard parking space, and there was a genuine chance the nose or the tail would still be hanging out into the lane of traffic, waving gently at anyone who happened to pass. The hood itself deserved its own kind of reverence. It stretched out ahead of the windshield like a runway disappearing toward a horizon you simply had to take on faith, a vast plain of painted steel that you could not fully see the end of no matter how you adjusted your seat. Experienced drivers eventually developed a kind of internal instinct for where the invisible front bumper actually sat. Everyone else simply crept forward slowly in parking lots until they heard a soft crunch, and then stopped, and then apologized. Why did the cars grow so large? Part of it was pure fashion, a widespread and largely unquestioned belief that bigger automatically meant better, more prestigious, more unmistakably American. But part of it was something a little more calculated. Detroit had discovered that customers would happily pay for length and presence, and sheet metal, relatively speaking, was cheap. So the cars simply kept growing, year over year, a little longer, a little wider, a little more dramatic, the way a fish left in a pond with no natural predator simply keeps growing because nothing has told it to stop. And here's the curious part. All that length did not translate directly into all that space. Yes, there was legroom to spare, and a trunk you could genuinely have furnished. But a surprising portion of the car's total length was pure decoration, long overhangs of hood and trunk extending well past the actual wheels, contributing nothing but visual drama. You were, in a very real sense, driving a car that was 1 part machine and 2 parts gesture, a vehicle where a meaningful fraction of its total length existed purely to look imposing from across a parking lot. Turning one of these machines was its own kind of physical event. The turning circle was wide enough that a simple U-turn on an ordinary street quietly became a 3-point turn, then a 5-point turn, then a small spectacle that pedestrians would actually stop to watch. Revering into a parking space required patience, a certain amount of faith, and ideally a friend standing somewhere behind the car waving their arms with increasing urgency. Parallel parking was reserved for the genuinely brave or the genuinely desperate. You did not so much fit the car into a space as convince the space, through sheer persistence, to accept it. And yet, out on the open highway, all of that unwieldy size transformed into something that felt, against all logic, magnificent. You sat up high, surrounded by acres of steel, looking down at smaller, lesser vehicles the way a captain looks down at rowboats from the deck of a much larger ship. The car felt permanent, indestructible, like something that might genuinely outlast the country it was built in. It would not, of course. Within a decade, it would likely be dissolving quietly into lace-thin rust along its lower edges. But on that open road, drifting serenely along in your enormous, gleaming barge, you felt, for just a little while, like the last and most comfortable emperor of a very spacious, very inefficient empire. Let's climb inside properly now, because getting into one of these cars was its own small adventure. You pulled open a door that seemed to weigh roughly as much as a bank vault, swinging wide on hinges clearly built to survive a century of use. There were no bucket seats waiting for you, no center console dividing the cabin in two. Just one long, unbroken plane of vinyl or velour stretching from the driver's door all the way across to the passengers. A bench built for a family that apparently traveled everywhere together, shoulder to shoulder, like a small congregation. Closing that door produced a deep, satisfying thunk, a heavy vault-like sound that engineers had genuinely spent real money and real effort perfecting, because that single sound made you feel, somewhere deep in your chest, that you had purchased something substantial. It hadn't, strictly speaking, meant the car was well built. It had only meant the door was heavy. But in the 1970s, those two ideas were very easily and very deliberately confused. Once inside, you found yourself sliding, quite literally, across that bench seat, because there was nothing built into it to stop you. This was the defining feature of the American interior of the decade, a wide, flat sofa upholstered in velour or vinyl, offering roughly the same lateral support as a sheet of ice. Take a corner with even mild enthusiasm, and the entire front row would slide gently sideways in unison, a slow-motion pileup of passengers ending in a soft heap against the far door. Seat belts, in the households that actually bothered to wear them, were often the only thing preventing the front seat from turning into a leisurely game of human bumper cars. That bench did have one genuine, undeniable advantage, and it mattered a great deal to large families. 3 adults could sit up front. 3 more could sit in the back. 6 people, 1 single automobile, nobody technically forced to sit on anyone else's lap. For carpools and big households, this was close to gold. Of course, the unlucky soul assigned to the middle of the front seat paid a price for that arrangement. There was nowhere to put their legs, because directly beneath them rose the transmission hump, a small mountain range of metal pushing up through the floor. They rode the entire trip with their knees somewhere near their ears, straddling that hump, staring directly at the column-mounted gear shifter, quietly resolving to sit somewhere else next time. Ah yes, the column shifter. On most of these cars, the gear selector wasn't tucked down between the seats the way you might expect today. It jutted out from the steering column itself, and you moved it up and down through park, drive, and reverse with a satisfying mechanical click. This cleared the floor for that third front passenger, which was, in its own way, rather clever design. It also meant the person unlucky enough to sit in the middle spent the entire drive with a metal lever hovering inches from their thigh, twitching gently every time the driver changed gears. A strange, involuntary kind of togetherness, very much of its era. Adjusting your seating position, on the more basic models, meant yanking a lever beneath you and throwing your entire body weight backward, sliding the whole bench along its track with a loud, satisfying clang. The fancier cars offered something close to a small miracle, a power seat, a little switch that hummed the entire bench through 6 directions of adjustment at a slow, stately, almost regal pace. It moved so gradually you could, quite comfortably, make yourself a sandwich while it worked. But it moved, and in the 1970s that alone counted as luxury. Settling in fully, you realized the entire cabin had been designed around exactly one governing idea: comfort above all else. It was soft. It was spacious. It was, in its own strange way, genuinely welcoming. It was also, quite obviously, a place where the laws of physics had been politely asked to step outside and wait. But none of that mattered yet, because before you'd even turned the key, you had already been sold. You weren't sitting inside a car. You were sitting inside a living room that happened to know how to merge onto a highway. Now let's talk about the interior styling properly, because Detroit in the 1970s had arrived at exactly one governing design philosophy, and that philosophy could be summarized in a single word: more. More padding, more buttons, more tufting, more of everything, applied with a kind of cheerful, unembarrassed enthusiasm that no other decade before or since has quite managed to replicate. The seats themselves were the true showpiece of the cabin. Detroit had discovered the deep button-tufted look sometime in the late 60s, and by the 70s it had lost its mind entirely, pulling upholstery into thick, puffy diamonds and soft, pillowy folds, until the seats began to resemble something closer to an overstuffed throne than a place to sit while operating heavy machinery. Velour was the fabric of the moment, plush and soft and genuinely wonderful to touch, at least for the first year or so, before it began attracting every crumb, pet hair, and stray fiber within a 5-foot radius and simply refused to let any of it go. On a hot summer afternoon, that velour held heat the way an oven mitt holds heat. On a cold winter morning, it held static electricity, the way a balloon rubbed against a wool sweater holds a grudge. But it looked plush, and in the 70s, looking plush was very much the entire point. Then there was the dashboard, and the dashboard told its own story. It was a wide, padded expanse, home to an ever-expanding cluster of buttons, knobs, toggles, and small glowing warning lights, each new luxury feature demanding one more control to operate it. The engineers who arranged these controls seemed to have worked from no particular logic at all, or at least none that survived contact with an actual driver. You'd reach for what you believed to be the wiper switch, and instead pop open the trunk. You go looking for the radio dial, and somehow activate the rear window defroster. Finding anything specific at night required either years of accumulated memorization or a fair amount of luck, since half the labels printed on the switches were simply too small to read in the dark, and the other half had already faded or worn away entirely from years of fingertips brushing past them. And then, of course, there was the wood. It wasn't actually wood, and nobody involved in the transaction was under any real illusion about that. It was a thin plastic film, printed with a convincing wood grain pattern and carefully glued onto flat surfaces throughout the cabin, across the dashboard, along the door panels, sometimes even wrapped around the steering wheel itself. Up close, in direct sunlight, it fooled precisely nobody. It had roughly the depth and warmth of a laminated diner menu. But from the driver's seat, in the soft glow of evening light, it did exactly the job it was designed to do. It quietly announced that this was a fine automobile, owned by a person of some substance, even as the edges slowly began to peel upward and bubble in the summer heat. All of this luxury signaling had a name, and the name was brougham, an old carriage term Detroit dug up from history and slapped onto trim packages with total confidence, despite the fact that almost nobody in the country was entirely certain how to pronounce it. That uncertainty, somehow, only made the word feel classier. A Brougham package meant your car arrived drenched in the visual language of luxury, thicker carpet underfoot, plusher seating, more chrome trim along the exterior, and enough of that fake wood paneling to reforest a modest-sized county. It was, in essence, the automotive equivalent of putting on a top hat simply to walk down to the corner store for a carton of milk. And America, it must be said, could absolutely not get enough of it. The lighting inside these cars added its own quiet touch of theater. The fancier models scattered small lamps throughout the cabin, glowing softly in the footwells, illuminating the door handles, casting a gentle amber light across all that velour-and-fake-wood grain. It made the interior feel, more than anything else, like the lobby of a modestly upscale hotel, which was, of course, precisely the intended effect. You weren't simply driving somewhere, you were arriving. And the car wanted you to feel that difference in your bones, every single time you slid into that seat. None of it taken together made the car faster, or safer, or more reliable in any measurable way. The velour would fade within a few summers. The fake wood would peel and curl at its corners. The buttons would eventually work themselves loose and vanish into the seams of the seats, never to be found again. The little amber lamps would burn out, one by one, over the years, until half the footwells sat in darkness. But when the car was new, sitting inside that padded, tufted, wood-grained little palace on wheels, you felt, for a while, genuinely like royalty. And in the 1970s, feeling like royalty was worth every single peeling, fatting, slowly disintegrating inch of it. It's morning now, and it's time to actually start the car. This, it turns out, is a considerably more complicated proposition than it sounds. This was still the age of the carburetor, a small, stubborn, entirely mechanical device that treated cold weather as something close to a personal insult. Starting your car on a chilly morning wasn't simply a matter of turning a key. It was a small, private ritual, performed slightly differently by nearly every driver in the country, and defended just as fiercely by each of them as the one true correct method. To understand why, you have to understand what the carburetor was actually doing under that long hood. Its job was to mix air and gasoline together in precisely the right proportion before feeding that mixture into the engine. When everything cooperated, this worked perfectly well. But the carburetor had no brain of its own, no sensors, no way of automatically adjusting itself to the temperature outside. It relied entirely on physical springs, valves, and a small mechanical device called the choke, all of which apparently had strong and shifting opinions about the weather, the humidity, and how cooperative they felt like being on any given morning. On a genuinely cold morning, the engine needed a noticeably richer fuel mixture just to catch and hold. That was the choke's entire purpose, restricting the incoming air so the fuel mixture ran heavier than usual. Some cars handled this automatically, more or less. Others required you to physically pull a small knob on the dashboard yourself and judge, by feel and experience, how far to pull it. Either way, the whole process was less a mechanical procedure and more a genuine art form. Too little fuel, and the engine simply wouldn't catch it all. Too much, and you flooded the thing entirely, drowning the engine in raw gasoline until it refused to start out of what felt very much like pure spite. There was a distinctive smell that came with this particular failure, sharp and unmistakable, the smell of a morning that had already started going wrong. The pumping of the gas pedal itself became something close to folk tradition, passed down through families like a closely guarded recipe. 2 firm pumps and hold. 3 quick pumps in rapid succession. 1 long, slow, deliberate press held to the floor. Your father swore by his particular method. Your neighbor swore by an entirely different one. Neither method was especially reliable, and both were defended with total, unwavering conviction. Starting the car, some mornings, became a genuine test of character, and the car itself seemed to be grading everyone rather harshly. When you did flood it, and eventually you would, The only real cure was patience, which nobody standing in the freezing cold at 7 in the morning in the middle of January actually possessed in any meaningful quantity. You had to stop entirely, wait for the excess fuel to evaporate out of the cylinders, and then try again with the accelerator pedal held flat against the floor the entire time. This meant standing outside in the cold, staring at a machine that had just personally betrayed you, watching your breath fog in front of your face, running steadily later for whatever you were supposed to be doing that morning. The car, for its part, did not care in the slightest. The car had all the time in the world. Even once the engine did finally catch and settle into a rough idle, you still weren't quite done. A cold engine running on a carburetor needed real time to warm up properly before it would run smoothly, stalling out and lurching if you tried to pull away from the curb too soon. So you sat there in your driveway, wrapped in a thin cloud of your own exhaust, letting the engine cough and shudder its way slowly up to operating temperature, while your breath fogged the inside of the windshield faster than the weak, wheezing heater could ever hope to clear it. Compare all of that to today, where you simply press a button, or don't even bother pressing anything at all, and the engine starts instantly, every single time in any weather without complaint or ceremony of any kind. Back then, successfully starting your car on a genuinely cold morning felt like a small, private daily victory over a stubborn and uncooperative machine. Some mornings you won. Some mornings the car won, and you simply gave up and took the bus instead. Either way, you came away with a small dose of humility, a good deal of patience, and an expanded vocabulary of words you absolutely could not use in front of your mother. Let's actually pop the hood now and look at what greets us underneath, because what we find isn't quite an engine so much as it is a crime scene involving a truly staggering amount of rubber spaghetti. Vacuum hoses snaked off in every conceivable direction, connecting to small devices whose exact purpose no ordinary driver fully understood, all of it existing in service of the new federal emissions regulations that had recently taken effect. There were valves. There were canisters. There were thin rubber lines that would, at some entirely unpredictable point in the future, quietly crack and just as quietly ruin your entire week. Somewhere underneath all of it sat an actual engine, doing its honest best, and looking in some abstract mechanical sense, deeply and thoroughly confused. To be fair to the engineers involved, this tangled mess wasn't entirely their fault. New clean air legislation demanded that cars pollute dramatically less than they had in the past, and this was, without question, a genuinely worthwhile goal, since the air over major American cities by the late 1960s had grown thick enough in places to practically chew. But the technology needed to achieve that reduction cleanly and elegantly simply did not exist yet in any mature form. So engineers found themselves bolting solution after solution onto engines that had originally been designed in a much simpler era, layering new device on top of new device the way a person keeps adding extra blankets in winter until they can no longer roll over in bed. The result was a genuinely bewildering tangle of vacuum lines, thin rubber hoses carrying suction around the engine bay to operate a whole range of emissions-related devices. A single engine might have several dozen of these hoses, branching and splitting in a pattern that resembled less a piece of careful engineering and more the root system of a particularly anxious houseplant. There was usually a diagram tucked somewhere in the service manual, an intricate schematic that mechanics studied with the grim, focused expression of a detective staring down a genuinely baffling case. When one of these small hoses inevitably cracked, and they cracked constantly, the engine would begin running poorly in strange, hard-to-diagnose ways, and tracking down the single guilty hose among dozens of identical-looking rubber lines could easily eat up an entire afternoon. Among the tangle sat a whole cast of new devices with intimidating, almost bureaucratic names. There was a system that recirculated exhaust gases back into the engine to cool the combustion process, which sounded at first like an obvious mistake, but was actually a clever bit of engineering. There was a small pump that blew fresh air directly into the exhaust stream to help burn off leftover unburned fuel. There was a canister packed with activated charcoal, tasked with capturing fuel vapors before they could escape into the atmosphere. Each device, taken on its own, generally worked well enough most of the time. Together, they formed a delicate, interconnected ecosystem, where the failure of any single part could cascade outward into a dozen unrelated-seeming symptoms. The real tragedy in all of this was what it did to the engine's overall temperament. These early emission systems were crude by later standards, and they choked the engine at nearly every step, restricting its airflow, retarding its ignition timing, leaning out its fuel mixture. Engines of this era ran noticeably hotter, stumbled more, hesitated more, and pinged under load in a way that made drivers wince. Step on the accelerator, and there would be a distinct pause, a moment of visible consideration, before the car reluctantly gathered itself together and began, slowly, to move. It felt very much like asking an extremely polite, extremely tired man to break into a sprint. Eventually he does it, but he would very much like you to know, through every labored breath, that he is not remotely happy about the request. For the home mechanic, and in the 1970s a great many ordinary people were still their own mechanics out of simple necessity, this new complexity was a genuine nightmare. A car from the 1950s or early 1960s you could largely understand. You could see the individual parts, trace each system with your own eyes, and fix most problems with a basic toolbox and a bit of common sense. This new tangle of hoses and canisters defied common sense entirely. You'd pop the hood, take one long look at the vacuum spaghetti staring back at you, feel something in your soul quietly step outside for some air, and gently close the hood again. The great American age of the shade tree mechanic was slowly, quietly coming to an end, strangled in no small part by its own vacuum hoses. And here, perhaps, is the cruelest part of the entire arrangement. All of this added complexity, all of these extra hoses and pumps and canisters, and the car still didn't run especially cleanly by the standards that would come only a decade or so later, and it certainly didn't run especially well. It was a transitional mess, an awkward middle chapter in automotive history, where the old technology had been pushed well past its natural limits, and the new technology hadn't fully arrived yet to take its place. The engine sitting underneath all that spaghetti was doing its honest best. It simply had no clear idea anymore what anyone actually wanted from it. And if we're being honest, at that particular moment in history, neither did anyone else. Let's talk now about power, or rather, about the strange and genuinely tragic disappearance of it. Beneath that enormous hood sat a massive V8, in many cases a genuine 400 cubic inch monster of an engine, the kind of power plant that, by every visual and historical expectation, should have launched you effortlessly into the next county. Instead, thanks to a combination of tightening emissions restrictions and a newly honest way of measuring horsepower, that same colossal engine produced roughly the muscle of a mildly motivated draft horse on a lazy afternoon. You had, quite literally, an engine the size of a small picnic table, producing less usable power than some of the era's larger motorcycles. The actual numbers tell a genuinely sad story, and they're worth sitting with for a moment. Big American V8 engines that had once, only a few years earlier, produced well over 300 horsepower saw their published output collapse dramatically within a remarkably short span of years, some falling all the way down to somewhere around 140 horsepower, and a handful dipping even lower than that. And this was coming out of engines displacing 6 or even 7 liters, truly enormous motors by any reasonable standard. Modern 4-cylinder engines, sometimes less than half that size, would eventually produce far more usable power than these giants ever managed. Your enormous 70s V8, judged by the standards of virtually any other era in automotive history, was alarmingly, almost comically weak. Two separate forces conspired together to gut that horsepower so thoroughly. The first, as we've already seen firsthand under the hood, was the tangle of new emissions equipment choking the engine at nearly every stage of its operation, all in service of meeting strict new clean air requirements. The second cause was a little sneakier and a little more interesting. The industry standard for how horsepower was measured had quietly changed. Manufacturers had previously quoted power figures measured from a bare engine sitting alone on a test stand, with nothing at all attached to slow it down. No accessories, no exhaust system, no transmission drag. Then the entire industry switched over to measuring power the way the engine actually sat inside the finished car, with every accessory and the full exhaust system connected and working against it. Overnight, the published numbers dropped dramatically, and much of that drop reflected the industry finally telling something closer to the honest truth. A car's advertised horsepower figure could plummet from one model year to the very next, even when the physical engine itself had barely changed at all, simply because the manufacturer had quietly stopped exaggerating quite so enthusiastically. It was as though the entire American auto industry had been standing on its tiptoes for the better part of 2 decades, and had finally, sheepishly, settled back down onto its heels. The muscular numbers of the 1960s had been, to put it gently, generous. The deflated numbers of the 1970s were rather closer to reality, and reality in this particular case was disappointing. What did all of this actually feel like from behind the wheel? It felt very much like piloting a very large, very comfortable boat that was powered primarily by a strong and sincere suggestion. You'd press down on the accelerator, and the car would, quite genuinely, think about it. The engine would produce all the deep, muscular sound of real power, a satisfying V8 rumble that promised so very much, and then deliver in the end comparatively little. All of the sound of genuine power, none of the actual accompanying shove. It was, in a way, the automotive equivalent of a full-grown lion that, when it finally opened its mouth to roar, simply says meow. Merging onto a highway under these circumstances became something close to a genuine strategic exercise. You couldn't simply floor the accelerator and rocket up to speed, because there was, quite frankly, no rocket hiding anywhere under that hood. You had to plan ahead, build your momentum gradually, hunt for a nice generous gap in traffic well in advance, and commit to the maneuver with real conviction and a fair amount of patience. Passing another car on a narrow 2-lane road demanded a long, clear, uninterrupted stretch of pavement, roughly the length of a small regional airport runway, along with a healthy dose of personal courage. Attempting to overtake anyone while heading uphill was best reserved for days with a favorable tailwind, and ideally, a fairly optimistic horoscope. There was a strange, almost poetic irony hanging over the entire situation. Here was the largest, heaviest, and most visually powerful-looking generation of American engines that Detroit had ever produced, and they turned out to be among the slowest cars of the entire modern era. The hood alone was vast enough to comfortably land a small aircraft on. The engine tucked beneath it was an absolute colossus in physical size. And the whole magnificent assembly, taken together, genuinely struggled to outrun a moderately determined cyclist pedaling up a steep hill. You had, in essence, all of the visual presence associated with raw American muscle, and almost none of the actual muscle to back it up. It was, in the truest sense, mostly presence. But my goodness, it was an awful lot of presence. Let's talk now about exactly why your once mighty engine had been so thoroughly and deliberately defeated. Because the real story here centers on a small, unassuming device called the catalytic converter. Starting partway through the decade, new cars began arriving from the factory fitted with this device, designed specifically to clean up the exhaust before it left the tailpipe. And this new device demanded, in turn, a brand new kind of fuel entirely, something called unleaded gasoline. Almost overnight, the entire country found itself having to relearn a task it had performed on autopilot for decades, the simple act of filling a gas tank. Gas stations scrambled to install new pumps, and accidentally putting the wrong fuel nozzle into your tank became a genuine, widely shared source of anxiety for ordinary drivers. The lead additive that had, for generations, helped engines run smoothly and quietly was now, gradually, being phased out entirely, and cars across the country spent much of the decade coughing their way awkwardly through that transition. Progress, it turned out, smelled faintly of a very hot exhaust pipe. The catalytic converter itself was, in truth, a genuinely clever piece of applied chemistry, a canister mounted somewhere along the exhaust pipe, packed with precious metals designed to trigger chemical reactions that turned genuinely nasty pollutants into considerably less nasty ones. In principle, it was brilliant, and it actually worked remarkably well, cleaning up tailpipe emissions in a way that all of those tangled vacuum hoses under the hood had never quite managed to achieve on their own. In practice, though, it introduced a brand new rule that reshaped how nearly everyone in the country bought gasoline. Leaded fuel would ruin the converter almost immediately, coating its precious metal core and rendering it useless within a remarkably short period. So from this point forward, any car fitted with a converter needed to drink unleaded fuel exclusively. For decades before this, gasoline sold across America had contained lead, added specifically because it helped engines run more smoothly and more quietly. Nearly every car on the road at the time ran on it, and nearly every pump in the country dispensed it without a second thought. Now, seemingly overnight, there was an entirely new fuel on the market, and the two simply could not be mixed. Cars fitted with converters needed unleaded fuel only. Older cars without converters could still run on either. Gas stations had to install entirely new pumps with new nozzles, and drivers, for possibly the first time in their driving lives, actually had to pay careful attention while standing at the pump. The physical nozzles themselves became part of the practical solution here. The fuel filler neck on any converter-equipped car was deliberately manufactured smaller in diameter, so that the fatter leaded gasoline nozzle simply could not physically fit inside it. This was, genuinely, a rather smart bit of foolproof engineering, an honest attempt to make the mistake physically impossible rather than merely forbidden by a sign at the pump. Of course, this being the real world, and people being people, plenty of drivers still found determined ways to jam the wrong nozzle in regardless, usually through a combination of brute force and questionable judgment, and then wondered, weeks later, why their brand new and rather expensive converter had died a slow, smoky death. There was, it has to be said, a real and understandable temptation lurking underneath all of this. Leaded gasoline was frequently cheaper at the pump, and plenty of drivers swore their engine ran just a little bit peppier on it, at least for a while. Some owners, grumbling openly about the new rules and about their car's noticeably sluggish performance, deliberately defeated that small filler neck restriction and fed their converter-equipped cars leaded fuel anyway, hopping to save a few cents per gallon and reclaim a bit of the engine's lost pep. This worked right up until it very much stopped working, poisoning the converter for good and, in some jurisdictions, running the driver afoul of newly written environmental law. It was a false economy dressed up, rather unconvincingly, as a small act of personal rebellion. The catalytic converter also ran remarkably hot during normal operation, hot enough, in fact, to become a genuine and documented fire hazard under the right conditions. Park a converter-equipped car directly over a patch of dry summer grass, and there was a real, measurable chance of accidentally starting a small fire as the glowing hot device radiated heat downward toward the ground beneath it. This led, in fairly short order, to printed warning stickers, more cautious parking habits among drivers, and more than one genuinely surprised car owner watching a thin curl of smoke rise up from beneath their own parked vehicle. But it's worth stepping back for a moment here, because the bigger picture genuinely does matter. The catalytic converter, and the slow, awkward death of leaded gasoline that came along with it, ranks among the truly good things to emerge from this whole strange, awkward automotive era. Removing lead from gasoline quietly and measurably improved public health across the country, in ways that hardly any driver cruising around in 1975 fully appreciated or understood at the time. And the converter itself set the basic technological template that cars would continue building on for decades afterward. It made the cars of its own particular moment run hotter, hungrier, and noticeably crankier, certainly. But it stands out as one of the rare genuine innovations of the decade that actually pointed the way forward, even while making your car smell, for a little while, faintly like a warm penny. Now let's actually drive this thing properly, an experience best described, with real affection, as something close to steering a large waterbed down a public highway. The suspension had been tuned so softly that the entire car floated down the road, wallowing gently over every bump and expansion joint like a small boat riding out a gentle swell. The steering itself was light, vague, and thoroughly disconnected from whatever the front tires happened to actually be doing, offering roughly the same tactile feedback as slowly stirring a large pot of soup. You'd turn the wheel, wait a beat, and eventually, almost as an afterthought, the car would consider your request and begin, gradually, to change direction. The ride quality was, without question, the entire point, the single feature Detroit's engineers were proudest of and advertised hardest across every medium available to them. Their guiding goal, above all others, was to isolate the passengers so completely from the surface of the road beneath them that they might genuinely forget they were traveling on one at all. Big, soft springs, squishy, well-cushioned shock absorbers, tall, billowy tires. All of it working together in quiet harmony to swallow bumps whole. Hit a genuine pothole, the kind that would rattle the fillings loose in a modern compact car, and the land yacht simply absorbed the impact entirely, rocking gently once or twice like a cradle being pushed by a patient hand. The trouble, inevitably, was that all of that softness carried a real and measurable cost, and the cost was control. All that generous suspension travel meant the car had very little genuine interest in staying flat or composed through a corner. Take even a moderately spirited turn, and the entire body would lean dramatically over to one side, tilting like a large ship changing course mid-ocean, the outside edge of the car diving down toward the pavement while your passengers slid gently sideways across the bench seat toward you. Brake hard, and the nose of the car dove sharply toward the ground. Accelerate firmly, and the tail squatted down low behind you. The car existed, essentially, in a constant, gentle state of seasick motion, rolling and pitching and heaving in response to nearly every input the driver gave it. The steering deserved its own particular note of scorn. Power steering came standard on nearly all of these big cars, a genuine necessity given their considerable weight, but it had been tuned almost entirely for effortlessness above every other consideration. The result was a steering wheel you could quite comfortably turn with a single finger. One that told you essentially nothing useful about what the front tires were actually doing on the road surface below. There was a vague, numb, disconnected quality to the whole experience, a persistent sense that the wheel in your hands and the road beneath the tires were only loosely acquainted with one another. On top of all that came a noticeable amount of built-in slop, meaning you could often rotate the wheel a fairly significant amount before anything at all happened at the front tires, a small dead zone of pure nothing sitting right at dead center. Driving in a straight line under these conditions was not the passive, relaxing act you might naturally assume it to be. Out on the open highway, the car genuinely wandered within its own lane. That combination of vague steering and soft, generous suspension meant it drifted gently from side to side, requiring constant, small, near-continuous corrections from the driver just to keep it pointed reasonably straight ahead. You never quite got to fully relax behind the wheel. You were always making tiny adjustments, nudging the big boat gently back onto course like a tugboat captain, guiding a much larger vessel through a narrow channel. It was tiring, in a low, persistent way that a modern car simply isn't. A quiet, ongoing conversation with a machine that kept losing its train of thought. Now imagine adding a genuine emergency into that mix. Suppose something suddenly darts out into the road ahead of you and you need to swerve immediately. You crank the wheel hard, and the car begins its slow, ponderous lean, the entire body rolling over onto those soft springs while the tires howl in protest, and the whole 2-ton mass reluctantly, gradually begins to change direction. There is a genuine, measurable delay between your input at the wheel and the car's eventual response, a moment of floating uncertainty, where you're honestly not entirely sure the vehicle even registered what you asked it to do. In that particular moment, you begin to understand rather clearly why these big cars earned something of a reputation for producing dramatic accidents. And yet, for the kind of ordinary, unhurried driving most people actually did on a daily basis, gliding gently down a wide boulevard or cruising serenely along an interstate, the whole experience was genuinely wonderful. You didn't so much drive a land yacht as you captained one, settling deep into that vast, soft seat and guiding the whole affair serenely down the road while the world drifted by outside the windows. It asked almost nothing of you, and it rewarded that lack of effort with genuine, pillowy comfort, so long as nothing unexpected happened, and so long as you never needed to stop or turn in any particular hurry. It was, in its own strange and specific way, one of the most relaxing ways to travel that had ever been devised. Those were, admittedly, some fairly substantial conditions attached to that relaxation. Let's discuss stopping now, which turns out to be more of a theoretical concept than you might reasonably hope for. Many of these cars still relied on drum brakes, at least at the rear, and sometimes on all four wheels, tasked with the considerable job of halting 2 full tons of American steel from highway speed. On a good, dry day, they worked reasonably well. Add a little rain, a little sustained heat, or a little genuine panic into the equation, and the pedal would begin to go soft beneath your foot, while the car kept its own quiet counsel about exactly when it intended to actually stop. You learned fairly quickly to plan your stops the way an old ship's captain plans a course correction, well in advance and with a considerable amount of faith. Tailgating, under these conditions, wasn't really an option so much as it was a dare. At the heart of the issue sat the drum brake itself, an older mechanical design that many of these cars relied on, often at the rear wheels and sometimes at all four. Inside a drum brake, curved metal shoes press outward against the inner surface of a spinning metal drum in order to slow the wheel down. It's a perfectly workable idea on its own merits, and it happens to be quite cheap to manufacture, which is precisely why Detroit favored it so heavily. But it carries one serious flaw that matters enormously when you're trying to haul down a genuinely heavy car from speed. It does not handle heat well at all. When you brake hard, or brake repeatedly in fairly quick succession, the resulting friction generates a tremendous amount of heat, and that heat needs somewhere to go. Drum brakes, by their very design, trap that heat, sealed away inside a metal drum with essentially nowhere to escape. As the brakes get progressively hotter, they get measurably weaker, a well-documented phenomenon known as brake fade. Press down on the pedal during a long downhill stretch, or through a series of hard consecutive stops, and you would genuinely feel it happening in real time, the pedal growing softer beneath your foot, sinking closer and closer to the floor, the car slowing less and less even as you push down harder and harder in response. It was a deeply unsettling sensation, not unlike squeezing what you expected to be solid steel, and instead feeling a soft, yielding sponge. The better-equipped cars of the era had already moved to front disc brakes, a genuinely superior design that allowed generated heat to escape freely into the open air and resisted fade far more effectively. This represented real, meaningful progress, and by the 1970s, front discs were becoming reasonably common across the industry. But the rear wheels, more often than not, still relied on old-fashioned drums, and plenty of the cheaper trim levels clung to drums on all four corners simply to keep manufacturing costs down. So your actual braking performance varied quite widely depending on exactly which trim level and options you'd originally purchased, and even the better-equipped setups were still asking an enormous amount of themselves, trying to reliably stop a vehicle that weighed roughly as much as a small whale. Water added its own additional complication into the mix. Drive through a sufficiently deep puddle, and the drums could genuinely fill partway with water, leaving the brakes barely functional at all for a stretch afterward. You'd emerge from the puddle, press firmly on the pedal, and feel the car simply continue onward largely unbothered, the soaked brakes doing next to nothing in response. The trick, which every reasonably experienced driver of the era eventually learned, was to ride the brakes gently for a short distance afterward, using the resulting friction heat to dry the drums back out. Until that happened, you were, in a very real and practical sense, essentially a passenger coasting along and quietly hopping for the best. All of this combined to fundamentally change how people actually drove these cars day to day. You could not, and did not, rely on being able to stop quickly. You left genuinely enormous following gaps ahead of yourself in traffic. You read the road far, far in advance of where you actually needed to react. You began slowing down for an upcoming stop long before a modern driver in a modern car would even think to lift off the accelerator. Braking became a deliberate, planned activity, initiated early and executed gently, because a genuine panic stop from real speed was, in every practical sense, a serious gamble. The car would eventually stop. It simply wanted plenty of advance notice, and it reserved the right to take its own sweet time getting there. Let's take a moment now to properly admire the bumpers, because by the middle of the decade they had become something close to genuinely heroic. New federal regulations demanded that a car be able to survive a modest, low-speed collision without sustaining any real damage, and Detroit, faced with that requirement, responded in the only way Detroit really knew how. It went big. The result was a set of chrome battering-rams bolted onto the front and rear of nearly every American car on sale, protruding a full foot or more from the body in some cases, adding a genuinely significant amount of weight, and giving every car on the road the permanent appearance of something braced, at all times, for imminent impact. Your car no longer looked quite so much like a vehicle. It looked more like a knight who had simply forgotten to remove his armor before getting behind the wheel. The regulation itself had started from a fairly sensible place. Insurance regulators had noticed that ordinary, low-speed parking bumps and minor fender benders were generating wildly expensive repair bills, crumpling fenders and shattering headlights over collisions that had, in truth, happened at little more than walking pace. So new rules were written mandating that a car's bumpers protect the vehicle from real damage during a light impact, first at a modest speed, and eventually at a full 5 miles per hour, both front and rear. The stated goal was simple enough: saving ordinary people real money on repair bills. The actual result was some of the most aggressively unattractive hardware ever bolted onto a passenger automobile. Detroit, faced with this new requirement, largely skipped past the more elegant engineering solutions and went straight for the obvious brute force answer. Rather than design something sleek and carefully integrated into the body, the simplest and cheapest path forward was simply to make the bumpers massive, heavy chrome beams mounted on their own dedicated shock absorbers, capable of taking a real hit and springing back into place afterward. These were not dainty decorative trim pieces bolted on as an afterthought. They were genuine structural elements, great blunt battering rams jutting outward from both ends of the car. On certain models, fitted with their large hydraulic shock mounts, the bumpers alone added the better part of an entire extra foot to the car's overall length. The shock absorbers tucked behind those bumpers represented a small marvel of deliberate over-engineering in their own right. Bump into something at a genuinely low speed, and the bumper would visibly compress inward on its mounts, absorbing the impact the way a boxer rolls with an incoming punch, before slowly pushing itself back outward to its original resting position once the danger had passed. If you happened to be bored, and perhaps slightly reckless, you could gently nudge the bumper against a solid wall and watch it squish inward and then slowly hiss its way back out again. An oddly satisfying little demonstration, not unlike pressing down on any sufficiently large spring. The aesthetic cost of all this newfound safety, however, was considerable. Cars that had originally been styled with sleek, carefully integrated bumper designs suddenly had to accommodate these enormous new appendages, and the resulting transition years were, by most accounts, rough on the eyes. Elegant designs sprouted large, awkward chrome shelves front and rear, frequently connected to the surrounding bodywork by ill-fitting rubber gaskets and filler panels that never quite lined up correctly. It was, in effect, as though every single car in America had suddenly been fitted with an oversized pair of orthopedic shoes. Pure function had bullied form into a corner and taken its lunch money without so much as an argument. And then, inevitably, there was the added weight. These new bumpers, along with their thick metal construction, their hydraulic shock mounts, and their considerable mounting hardware, added serious additional pounds to both ends of an already enormous car. Remember, this was already an era defined by enormous, heavy vehicles powered by weak, thoroughly choked engines. Now you were strapping the equivalent of a couple of anvils onto the nose and tail of that already struggling machine. The extra mass made the already sluggish cars slower still, thirstier still, and noticeably more ponderous both to stop and to steer through a corner. Every single pound added in the name of safety was one more pound the poor, overworked engine now had to drag around behind it. But give the ugly things their proper due, because they genuinely worked. A minor fender bender that would have cost a genuine fortune to repair in an earlier generation of car became, essentially, a complete non-event, the bumper absorbing the entire blow and springing back afterward with nothing more than a light surface scuff to show for it. In the everyday rough and tumble of city parking, where people had long since grown accustomed to bumping their way into tight spaces largely by feel, these nearly indestructible chrome rams saved untold sums of money and no small amount of everyday headache. Your car looked, in a very real sense, as though it were wearing armor because in a very real, practical sense, it genuinely was. It wasn't pretty. It certainly wasn't light. And it definitely wasn't fast. But it could shrug off a minor bump that would have flattened your household budget in almost any other decade. And in the 1970s, that alone counted as a genuine triumph. Now let's try to start the car once more, only this time, for a brief and genuinely maddening stretch in the middle of the decade, it flatly refuses. Federal regulators had introduced a new requirement, an ignition interlock system, meaning the car simply would not start at all unless the driver had first buckled their seat belt. You'd sit down, turn the key, and nothing would happen. A persistent buzzer would nag at you, with all the relentless energy of an especially anxious relative, until you finally gave in and complied. Drivers, across the entire country, were so genuinely enraged by this new arrangement that people began rigging their belts in creative ways, buckling them permanently behind their own backs and sitting on top of them. And eventually, remarkably quickly, an outraged Congress caved and simply killed the requirement outright. It stands as a rare piece of safety technology that proved so thoroughly annoying. It was legislated out of existence almost as fast as it had arrived. The underlying intentions here, as they so often were throughout this decade, had been genuinely good ones. Seat belts undeniably saved lives, and this was already well understood at the time. And yet, hardly anyone was actually wearing them voluntarily. They were widely seen as uncomfortable, unnecessary, a minor nuisance that was really more for other, more careless people. So regulators reasoned, with a certain cold, abstract logic, that if people simply wouldn't buckle up on their own, then perhaps the car itself should refuse to function at all until they did. It was the kind of idea that seems perfectly sensible in a quiet policy meeting, right up until the moment it collides directly with actual human beings who are already running late for work. The system itself worked by sensing whether there was meaningful weight resting on a given seat, and cross-checking that against whether the corresponding seatbelt had actually been fastened. Place a person, or a heavy bag of groceries, or a full toolbox onto the passenger seat, and the car would immediately demand that the corresponding belt be buckled before it would allow the engine to turn over at all. Fail to comply, and you got absolutely nothing in response but an insistent buzzer and stubborn, total silence from the ignition. The car had, in effect, been given the direct power to refuse you outright, and it exercised that power with all the smug, unwavering persistence of an especially dedicated hall monitor. People hated the system instantly, and they hated it completely, and crucially, the whole arrangement turned out to be remarkably easy to fool. Set a bag of groceries down on the empty passenger seat, and the car would begin nagging insistently about the unfastened passenger belt. So drivers quickly learned to simply buckle the empty seat's belt permanently in place and sit down directly on top of it, or toss their bags into the footwell instead of onto the seat itself. Plenty of drivers took to buckling their own seat belt first and then sitting down deliberately on top of it, thereby defeating the entire underlying safety purpose of the system while still perfectly satisfying its sensor. The interlock, in the end, didn't really succeed in making people wear their seat belts properly. It mostly just made people remarkably creative about pretending to. The public backlash arrived swiftly, and for a piece of federal automotive regulation, it proved remarkably fierce. This was one of those rare cases where genuine, widespread public fury actually managed to reverse a federal rule almost as quickly as it had been introduced. Complaints poured into congressional offices from every corner of the country. Local mechanics did a genuinely brisk side business, quietly disabling the systems for frustrated customers. And lawmakers, hearing a steady stream of outrage from constituents who had all been buzzed at insistently by their own automobiles, moved fairly quickly to kill the entire requirement. Within a remarkably short period of time, the mandatory interlock system was simply gone, one of the shortest-lived safety mandates in the entire history of American automotive regulation. What replaced it turned out to be considerably gentler, and somewhat ironically, far longer lasting. The simple audible reminder. Instead of outright refusing to start at all, cars would now merely nag you gently, a light chime pestering the driver to please buckle up, but ultimately leaving the final decision squarely in the driver's own hands. This approach proved far more broadly acceptable, precisely because it respected the driver's own stubborn insistence on remaining in charge, even if that meant remaining in charge of their own personal risk. People, it turned out, would tolerate being gently nagged. They would not tolerate being flatly commanded by their own car. The whole episode reads, in hindsight, like something of a perfect little parable for the entire decade. Here was a genuinely good underlying goal, wrapped in a heavy-handed and rather clumsy solution, imposed on a general public that responded not by quietly complying, but by rebelling with real, impressive ingenuity. The seatbelt interlock joined a long and growing list of well-intentioned 1970s ideas that looked entirely sensible in a laboratory setting, and turned out to be a genuine disaster once they reached an actual driveway. And it left behind, as a quiet legacy, that soft, familiar chime we still hear in cars today, the mellow, well-mannered descendant of a device once so infuriating that an entire outraged nation rose up and had it formally banned. Now take a look at the speedometer itself, because it amounts to a small, quiet work of comedy sitting directly in front of the driver. Later in the decade, a new federal rule capped the printed numbers on the dial at exactly 85 miles per hour, apparently on the theory that if drivers simply couldn't see any higher number staring back at them, they wouldn't dream of driving that fast in the first place. Never mind, of course, that most of these particular cars genuinely struggled to reach 85 miles per hour under any circumstances, even if you'd push them gently off the edge of a cliff to help things along. The gauge became, in effect, a small monument to pure bureaucratic optimism, a dashboard poster promising a level of performance that the engine underneath had absolutely no genuine intention of ever delivering. To really understand this, you have to remember the broader national mood surrounding speed at the time. In the immediate wake of the oil crisis, the country had adopted a new national speed limit of 55 miles per hour, sold to the public primarily as a straightforward way to conserve increasingly scarce and expensive fuel. Speed itself was suddenly being framed, in public messaging, as wasteful, as dangerous, even as faintly unpatriotic. So the underlying thinking went that if the speedometer simply didn't display large, tempting, dramatic numbers, and instead prominently highlighted that 55 mark, drivers might be gently nudged toward a kind of everyday automotive virtue. The gauge became, in this sense, less a precise instrument and more a small piece of quiet propaganda mounted directly behind the steering wheel. So the dials themselves were redesigned across the industry, their top printed number lowered all the way down to 85, with the 55 limit itself frequently marked in a special contrasting color as a gentle, ever-present visual reminder of exactly where a responsible driver's conscience ought to sit. Gone, at least for a while, were the old confident speedometers that swept all the way up to 120 or beyond, promising velocities the underlying car might theoretically have been capable of reaching. In their place sat these newer, more cautious, deliberately truncated little dials, quietly insisting that 85 was really as fast as anyone could ever possibly need to go, or even reasonably imagine going. The genuine comedy in all of this, of course, was that the number was pure fantasy in both directions at once. On one hand, 85 miles per hour was being presented as a reckless, almost outlaw-level upper extreme, a speed reserved for madmen and daredevils. On the other hand, the average, sluggish, emissions-choked land yacht of the era would take a very long stretch of open road and a genuinely long time to actually reach 85 miles per hour at all, and would arrive there wheezing audibly the entire way. The gauge marked, as its supposed terrifying maximum, a speed the underlying car itself was barely mechanically capable of attaining in the first place. It was, in effect, a printed warning about a danger the vehicle beneath it was almost entirely incapable of actually posing. There was something genuinely poignant buried in all of it, if you looked closely enough. Here was a speedometer pointing insistently toward 85, as if to say, quite solemnly, beware, thrill seeker, here be dragons, mounted directly into a car whose actual engine produced perhaps 140 horsepower on a good day, and whose brakes politely requested a fair bit of advance notice before actually stopping. The stark disconnect between the dial's implied drama and the car's genuine, everyday character summed up the entire decade rather perfectly. Drivers, naturally enough, adapted with their usual mixture of quiet resignation and mild, good-natured rebellion. Those who genuinely wanted to travel faster than the dial seemed to suggest simply did so, watching the needle pin itself firmly against that 85 mark and quiver there while the car droned on at whatever modest pace it could actually manage. The gauge told you essentially nothing useful once you passed its printed limit. You simply knew, from the wind noise and the engine note, that you were going somewhat faster than it was willing to publicly admit. The rule, thankfully, didn't last forever. Eventually, the larger printed numbers crept quietly back onto the dials as the broader national mood shifted once again, and the underlying logic of the whole arrangement gradually collapsed under its own gentle absurdity. But for a genuine stretch of years there, nearly every new car sold in America carried this small, cheerful little lie printed right on its dashboard, a gauge that capped human ambition neatly at 85 and quietly marked righteousness at 55. It amounted, in the end, to regulation dressed up as interior decoration, a small moral lesson printed onto plain glass, and it presided, night after night, over cars that could not conceivably have broken any meaningful speed limit, even with a genuinely stiff tailwind pushing them along the whole way. Let's talk now about fuel economy, or rather, about its near total and almost willful absence. Your land yacht, with its enormous, thirsty V8 dutifully hauling 2 full tons of steel and chrome down the highway, delivered fuel economy that was really best measured in gallons per mile rather than the other way around. Somewhere around 10 or 12 miles to the gallon was considered, at the time, a perfectly reasonable and unremarkable figure. Nobody worried about this in the slightest, right up until the precise moment that the entire country, quite suddenly, had to. The car itself had been conceived and designed during an era of cheap, seemingly endless gasoline, and that particular era was about to come to an end with genuinely spectacular bad timing. The underlying math was, in retrospect, fairly brutal. A big American sedan of the period might manage somewhere around 12 miles to the gallon in ordinary mixed driving, and considerably worse than that around town, particularly with the air conditioning running, in cold weather, or while hauling any kind of meaningful cargo. Some of the very largest and thirstiest models of the decade dipped all the way down into single-digit territory, sipping fuel the way a fire hose sips water. You could, quite literally, watch the fuel gauge needle drift steadily downward as you drove, sinking toward empty like a slow, expensive, and thoroughly predictable sunset. For most of American automotive history up to that particular point, nobody had cared much about any of this, and for a fairly good reason. Gasoline in America had long been astonishingly cheap, cheaper than in almost any other country on earth, and it seemed, for all practical purposes, to be in endless and permanent supply. When fuel cost mere pennies a gallon, and the pumps genuinely never ran dry, why on earth would any ordinary buyer worry themselves over how thirsty their car happened to be? Efficiency, under those conditions, was widely treated as a virtue reserved for the overly timid. Real cars, proper American cars, drank deeply and drank proudly, and the resulting size of your monthly fuel bill was considered a fairly small price to pay for all that glorious steel. So the cars of the era were designed with a kind of total, cheerful indifference to fuel consumption. Engineers optimized relentlessly for smoothness, for interior size, for a hushed, quiet ride, but almost never for genuine efficiency. The engines themselves were huge and unhurried, geared specifically for effortless highway cruising rather than for squeezing extra miles out of every gallon. Aerodynamics, meanwhile, were treated as something close to an afterthought. These cars carried the wind-cheating profile of an upright chest of drawers, pushing an enormous flat vertical face directly through the oncoming air, and dragging an equally enormous body along behind it. Every single design choice made throughout this period assumed, implicitly, that gasoline would remain cheap and plentiful more or less forever, which felt, at the time, like a perfectly safe and reasonable assumption to make, right up until the moment it catastrophically, suddenly wasn't. The tragedy of timing here is almost too perfect to be believed. Detroit had spent years methodically building the biggest, heaviest, and thirstiest cars it had ever produced, doubling down again and again on size and softness, adding heavier and heavier bumpers and ever more power-hungry accessories along the way, all while the underlying engines grew steadily weaker, and the overall fuel appetite of the industry remained enormous. The entire industry was, in effect, steering serenely, and with total commitment straight toward an iceberg it simply couldn't see coming. Everything about these cars had been quietly premised on the continued existence of cheap gasoline, and cheap gasoline was, without any real warning, about to vanish almost overnight. When it did vanish, the fuel economy numbers that virtually nobody had cared about a year earlier suddenly became the only numbers that mattered at all. A car that drank 12 miles to the gallon had been perfectly fine when fuel was cheap and freely available. It became a genuine financial catastrophe the moment fuel prices spiked sharply and lines of waiting cars began stretching around city blocks. Families who had happily and proudly purchased the biggest, most impressive car on the entire dealer lot, suddenly found themselves shackled to a machine that cost a genuine fortune simply to keep fed, assuming, of course, that they could even manage to find fuel to feed it with in the first place. The thirst that had once been treated as a proud afterthought had, seemingly overnight, become an inescapable, deeply painful headline. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, because right now, in this particular moment, none of that has actually happened yet. Right now, gasoline remains cheap, your tank sits full, and 12 miles to the gallon simply isn't anybody's problem yet. You cruise contentedly along in a kind of blissful, fuel-drenched ignorance, the big V8 guzzling away contentedly beneath the hood, the needle sinking without a single care in the world. The reckoning is coming, and it's coming soon, and when it finally arrives, it will reshape nearly everything about how the American car is designed. But tonight, for now, the pumps are flowing freely, the fuel remains cheap, and your magnificent, thirsty barge is drinking its fill under a sky that has genuinely no idea yet what's about to happen. And here it comes, the oil crisis. In 1973, an international oil embargo sent fuel prices soaring dramatically and left gas stations across the country running dry. The nation that had spent an entire decade building the single thirstiest fleet of cars on the planet suddenly, quite abruptly, couldn't feed them. Long lines of cars stretched for entire city blocks outside gas stations, engines idling away the very fuel their drivers were waiting patiently in line to purchase. Some regions turned to formal rationing schemes, allowing drivers to fill up only on odd or even calendar days depending on the final digit of their license plate. Almost overnight, your glorious land yacht transformed, in the eyes of many, from a proud status symbol into something closer to an embarrassing liability, a 2-ton monument to a purchasing decision you were rapidly beginning to regret. The crisis itself had arrived from far away, and yet it hit home with genuinely astonishing speed. A coalition of major oil-producing nations, angered by international political developments, cut off oil shipments to the United States, and the resulting effects rippled through the entire domestic economy in a matter of mere weeks. A nation that had built its entire everyday way of life around the comfortable assumption of cheap, endless fuel discovered, in the space of a few short weeks, that fuel was, in fact, neither cheap nor endless after all. Prices shot upward dramatically, and for the first time in living memory, there simply wasn't enough gasoline available to go around for everyone who wanted it. The long, snaking lines became the defining image that seared itself permanently into the national memory of that period. At gas stations scattered across the entire country, cars queued up in enormous, winding lines, sometimes waiting for hours on end. Hopping the pump ahead of them wouldn't run dry before their own turn finally arrived. Tempers flared regularly. Occasional fights broke out. People sat fuming behind the wheel of their own idling cars, quietly burning precious fuel simply in order to wait in line for more fuel. There was a certain bitter absurdity buried in the whole scene. All of these enormous, thirsty machines lined up nose to tail, steadily consuming the very resource they were each so desperately hopping to purchase. Local and state governments scrambled quickly to manage the widespread shortage through various rationing schemes, some of them genuinely fairly clever under the circumstances. In many areas, you could only legally purchase gasoline on certain designated days, depending on whether your license plate happened to end in an odd or an even number. Individual stations flew colored flags or posted hand-lettered signs out front, green if they still had fuel in stock, red if they'd already run completely out, allowing drivers to gauge their odds of success before committing themselves to a long wait in line. People began topping off their tanks obsessively at every opportunity, hoarding extra fuel in spare cans kept at home, treating a genuinely full tank of gas as a small, hard-won personal triumph in an increasingly uncertain world. For the proud owner of a giant land yacht, all of this amounted to a very particular and specific kind of nightmare. The very car that had felt like the absolute pinnacle of personal success only a few months earlier now felt, suddenly, like a genuine burden, an enormous fuel-guzzling anchor in a world that had abruptly turned stingy with gasoline. Every single trip now cost noticeably more. Every fill-up took longer, proved harder to accomplish, and cost considerably more money than it had only a season before. The very size and thirst that had once been the entire proud point of owning such a car had quietly become a source of genuine, quiet embarrassment. Owning the biggest car on the entire block no longer clearly announced that you had made it in life. It increasingly suggested, instead, that you simply hadn't been paying close enough attention. Meanwhile, the small, notably efficient imported cars that Detroit had confidently waved off for years as a passing curiosity suddenly began to look remarkably clever indeed. A small car that sipped fuel carefully, one you could genuinely still afford to keep running through an ongoing shortage, went from being viewed as a mildly odd curiosity to being seen as genuinely, deeply appealing almost overnight. People who had never seriously considered owning anything but a big American car began, quietly and gradually, to reconsider their long-held assumptions. The seed of a truly massive coming shift in the American automotive market was planted right there, in those endless gas lines, in all of that shared frustration and unexpected expense of trying to feed a machine that had been built for an entirely different world, one that had just abruptly ended. The oil crisis eventually passed, as crises tend to do, and fuel began flowing freely once again. But it had permanently changed something fundamental in the national mindset. The comfortable illusion of endless, cheap gasoline had been thoroughly broken, and it simply could not be unbroken again afterward. Everyone who had personally sat through those endless lines, who had rationed and hoarded and quietly cursed at their own thirsty barge, carried that memory forward with them for years afterward. The American car could no longer reasonably be designed as though fuel simply didn't matter, because now everyone understood, in their bones, that one day it very well might matter enormously again, and quite possibly without any real warning at all. The land yacht's days from that point forward were genuinely numbered, and the number itself had just gotten considerably smaller. Speaking of filling up, let's actually pull into a gas station properly, because in the 1970s, at least for a good stretch of the decade, this was a surprisingly full-service affair. An attendant in a clean uniform would trot out to meet your car, pump your gas for you, check your oil without being asked, and wipe down your windshield, all as a matter of routine courtesy. You never even had to leave your own seat. Of course, this was also the very same decade in which gasoline abruptly became expensive and genuinely scarce, so that same friendly attendant might occasionally also be the bearer of some fairly unwelcome news. It amounted in many ways to the very last golden age of being genuinely pampered at the pump, arriving right before the pump itself began pampering your wallet in the opposite direction entirely. The full-service ritual itself was a genuine everyday pleasure, a small piece of ordinary luxury that's almost difficult to properly imagine today. You'd pull up alongside the pumps, and before you'd even had time to fully switch off the engine, an attendant would already be approaching your window. You'd tell him how much fuel you wanted, or simply say fill it up, and he'd get straight to work. While the tank filled steadily, he'd move briskly around the car with practiced, easy efficiency, squeegeeing the windshield clean, and if you happened to ask, popping the hood to check your oil level and other essential fluids. You sat comfortably in your own seat, essentially like visiting royalty, and simply watched the whole small ceremony unfold. These attendants formed a real and genuine part of the everyday fabric of the era, uniformed and often quite cheerful, working at stations that actively competed with one another on friendly service just as much as on price. They knew the regular customers by name. They knew the individual cars. They could often tell you, with a practiced glance, when something under the hood didn't look quite right. A genuinely good attendant might casually warn you that your oil was running a bit low, or that a belt was starting to fray, catching small mechanical problems early, well before they turned into full roadside disasters. The gas station, in this sense, functioned as a genuine place of everyday human contact, a quick, friendly transaction repeated thousands of times a day, a small, ordinary kindness dispensed right alongside the actual fuel itself. The stations themselves were often kept remarkably tidy, cheerful little places painted in bright corporate colors, adorned with the competing logos of the big oil companies, each one fiercely competing for your ongoing brand loyalty. Many gave away small promotional trinkets as a matter of course: drinking glasses, folded paper road maps, small toys for the kids in the back seat, all in an ongoing effort to keep you coming back specifically to their particular brand. Collecting a full matching set of promotional drinking glasses simply by buying your gasoline at the same station over time was a genuinely real and common thing people did. There was a clear, palpable sense that the station itself actively wanted your business and was genuinely willing to work for it, a kind of competitive everyday courtesy that made the simple act of filling up feel almost pleasant. Then the oil crisis arrived, and the entire mood at the pumps curdled almost overnight. That same friendly attendant who had once pampered you now found himself standing guard over a genuinely rationed and increasingly precious commodity, and the tone of the conversation changed entirely as a result. Now he might have to wave you off entirely because the station had simply run out of fuel that day, or explain that you could only buy gasoline on certain designated days, or inform you that there was now a strict limit on exactly how much you were allowed to purchase at any one time. The pump that had once been a place of easy, cheerful abundance became, almost overnight, a place defined instead by scarcity, mounting tension, and long, anxious waiting lines. The attendant's job itself shifted, in the span of only a few months, from pampering satisfied customers to actively managing widespread frustration, and the numbers spinning steadily upward on the pump told the real story of the decade all on their own. In the good years, that total had ticked upward slowly, gasoline priced so cheaply that filling even a genuinely enormous tank barely dented anyone's wallet. As the crisis took hold, those same spinning numbers accelerated alarmingly, the price per gallon climbing to heights that would have seemed genuinely impossible only a few short years earlier. Watching that total mount steadily as your thirsty land yacht drank its fill became a small, recurring heartbreak, repeated week after week without fail. The full-service era, sadly, wouldn't last forever. In the years that followed, self-service pumps gradually spread across the country as stations looked to cut labor costs and pass those savings, or at least a portion of them, along to the customer. The uniformed attendant who had once checked your oil and wiped your windshield gradually vanished from most stations, replaced instead by a simple pay here sign and a pump you now had to operate entirely by yourself. It was, without question, more efficient and often somewhat cheaper as a result. But something genuinely warm went out of the ritual in the process. For one last stretch there in the 1970s, pulling into a gas station still meant being properly taken care of, sitting back comfortably while someone in a crisp uniform tended carefully to your enormous machine. It was, in its own quiet way, the golden twilight of being pampered at the pump, and most people didn't fully realize it was ending until it had, quite genuinely, already gone. Let's look up now at the roof, because up there you'll find one of the decade's strangest and most beloved fashions, the vinyl top. For a bit of extra money, the factory would glue an entire layer of textured vinyl fabric directly over your car's steel roof, creating the visual impression of a convertible, which it very much was not. It fooled essentially nobody, and it served no genuine mechanical purpose whatsoever beyond pure style. Worse still, it quietly trapped moisture underneath itself against the bare metal, meaning the very feature designed to make your car look fancier was, in a slow and largely invisible way, actively giving your roof a kind of disease. The whole idea carried a certain real history behind it. Long before this era, some genuinely upscale cars really had featured fabric convertible tops, and a covered roof had long carried a strong association with expense, craftsmanship, and old-world quality. The vinyl roof of the 1970s was, in essence, a nod backward toward that older heritage, a way of suggesting handcrafted, old-world luxury on a car that had, in reality, been stamped out of sheet steel by the thousands on a modern assembly line. It was pure visual shorthand, nothing more. A vinyl roof quietly said, "This is a nicer car. Please regard its owner as a person of genuine taste," even though the whole thing was, underneath the surface, simply plastic glued directly onto bare steel. And people loved it, genuinely and enthusiastically. The vinyl roof became remarkably popular across the entire industry, offered in a wide range of colors and surface textures, sometimes covering the entire roof from front to back, sometimes covering only the rear portion in a style specifically meant to evoke an old folding convertible top. Paired together with opera windows and a padded, formal Landau-style look, it represented something close to the very height of personal luxury fashion for the era. A brougham without a proper vinyl roof felt somehow incomplete, a little underdressed, rather like a fine suit worn without any tie at all. So the vinyl top sold in genuinely enormous numbers, and for a stretch of years, something close to half the cars on any given American road were wearing one. The trouble, as with so many ideas born in this particular decade, lurked quietly underneath the surface. That vinyl covering was glued directly onto the painted steel roof beneath it, and moisture had an uncanny way of finding its way underneath through tiny seams, along worn edges, and eventually through the small cracks that inevitably developed over years of sun exposure. Once water became trapped between that vinyl layer and the bare metal underneath, it had essentially nowhere else to go, and it simply sat there against the steel, doing exactly what trapped moisture always does to bare metal over time. It rusted the roof out slowly, silently, and almost entirely invisibly, hidden away beneath the very decoration that was supposed to be making the car look more expensive in the first place. By the time an owner actually noticed anything was wrong, it was often already too late. The vinyl would begin to bubble, blister, and lift gently at its edges, and when you finally peeled it back to investigate, you'd frequently find the roof underneath eaten through with rust. In some particularly severe cases, rusted clean through to visible daylight. The luxury feature had, quite literally, become a slow-acting moisture trap, a rust incubator sitting proudly on the single highest, most visible part of the entire car. The fancy hat, as it turned out, wasn't simply decorative after all. It was actively hostile toward the very head it sat on. Ongoing upkeep didn't help matters much either. Vinyl roofs required regular, dedicated care, special cleaners and protective dressings applied periodically to keep the material from drying out, fatting, and eventually cracking under the relentless summer sun. Neglect that maintenance even slightly, and the vinyl would gradually turn chalky and brittle, splitting open along its natural folds and looking distinctly shabby within just a few short years. So the very feature meant to signal effortless, old-money luxury actually demanded a fair amount of ongoing personal effort simply to keep it from becoming a genuine eyesore. A well-maintained vinyl roof looked genuinely sharp and distinguished. A neglected one looked, more than anything, like the car was slowly molting. Even so, the vinyl roof endures firmly in popular memory as one of the truly great signature looks of the entire decade, every bit as instantly recognizable as avocado kitchen appliances or thick shag carpeting underfoot. That padded, textured top, gleaming under a fresh coat of protective dressing, evoking a sense of luxury that was, in reality, about 90% pure suggestion, defined the entire personal luxury car segment almost completely on its own. It represented style triumphing over substance in about its purest possible form, a decorative flourish that added real cost, demanded ongoing maintenance, and quietly, patiently destroyed the very car it had been applied to adorn. And people paid the extra money for it gladly, because in the 1970s, looking expensive mattered a great deal more than the comparatively small matter of your roof slowly dissolving away underneath its stylish plastic hat. While we're studying the exterior, let's take a moment to properly admire the opera windows, because these were small, often oval-shaped little windows set directly into the thick rear roof pillar of the car, and they were, at the time, widely considered the very height of automotive sophistication. You genuinely could not see out of them in any meaningfully useful way. They did not open. They served no practical purpose whatsoever, and they were frequently paired with a small decorative exterior lamp known as an opera light, because apparently nothing quite said elegance the way a small decorative light bulb did. It was, in effect, a window whose entire job existed purely to suggest that something suitably classy was happening somewhere inside the car. The name itself gives away the whole underlying aspiration. Opera window. It conjured up images of elegant horse-drawn carriages pulling up outside grand opera houses, of well-dressed passengers glimpsed briefly through small, refined windows, of an entire world defined by old wealth and cultivated taste. Detroit took that particular fantasy and rendered it, quite literally, as a small piece of fixed glass set into the rear roof pillar of an otherwise perfectly ordinary mass-produced coupe. And remarkably, it worked, at least on the level of pure visual suggestion. That little window whispered old money and cultivated refinement to a buyer who was, in cold, practical reality, financing a mass-produced two-door coupe over a period of 4 long years. Functionally speaking, of course, these windows were complete nonsense. A real window's basic job is to let you see out clearly and, ideally, to open properly for fresh air. The opera window accomplished neither task. It was small, permanently fixed in place, and positioned in a spot that offered essentially no useful visibility whatsoever, tucked away into the thick roof pillar directly behind the rear doors. If anything, the entire broader styling trend that produced these windows actually made it noticeably harder to see clearly out of the car, since these vehicles already suffered from genuinely large blind spots created by their thick, stylish roof pillars. The opera window amounted, in the end, to a tiny decorative porthole set into an otherwise solid wall, purely ornamental and entirely useless. They arrived in a genuinely delightful variety of shapes, each one somehow more mannered and fussy than the last. Some were small, simple ovals. Some were shaped like gentle teardrops. Others were fashioned to resemble little heraldic shields or fussy geometric rectangles, frequently trimmed in bright chrome and sometimes even etched with a decorative pattern or an entirely invented coat of arms. The more formal and upscale a particular car aspired to appear, the more elaborate its opera windows tended to become, until you had ordinary coupes rolling down suburban streets sporting tiny heraldic emblems frosted directly onto glass roughly the size of a small paperback book. It amounted, in effect, to a kind of invented heraldry for people whose actual ancestral estate happened to be a modest split-level house in the suburbs. The opera light served as the natural companion piece to all of this, and it was, in its own way, perhaps even more gloriously pointless still. This was a small decorative lamp mounted on the exterior of the rear roof pillar, positioned right beside the opera window itself, and it would glow gently whenever the car's headlights were switched on. It illuminated absolutely nothing of any practical use. It served no genuine safety function, marked no hazard of any kind, and helped literally nobody see anything more clearly. Its entire function, from beginning to end, was simply to add one more small, glowing note of elegance to the car's overall profile, a decorative twinkle meant purely to suggest refinement to anyone glancing over from the sidewalk. It was, quite literally, a light whose only real job was to be a nice, pleasant little touch. Together, the opera window and its companion opera light formed something close to the perfect emblem of the entire personal luxury car philosophy of the decade. Neither one did anything of practical use at all. Both cost real money to include. Both existed purely to signal taste, class, and general expense to anyone happening to look at the car from the outside. This amounted, in effect, to styling as pure theater, ornamentation entirely for its own sake, form utterly divorced from function and seemingly unbothered by that particular divorce. The car was, in a very real sense, performing luxury, and the audience for that performance was every neighbor, every passerby, every stranger who happened to see it roll past on the street. And the genuinely strange thing is, it worked remarkably well. People sincerely wanted these particular features, actively sought them out on the order form, paid real extra money for them, and felt noticeably classier for having them fitted. The opera window and its glowing little companion tapped into something real and human, a genuine desire to feel elegant and distinguished, to drive something that at least suggested a somewhat finer life than the one being lived day to day. That the window itself blocked useful visibility, and the little lamp illuminated nothing at all mattered, in the end, not one single bit. In the 1970s, a car didn't just need to be genuinely luxurious. It needed to visibly look luxurious from every conceivable angle, right down to a small useless window and a decorative lamp shining quietly on absolutely nothing at all. Let's check now on the body of the car itself, which turns out to be something of a mistake, because it's already quietly rusting away beneath the surface. Detroit's overall quality control during the 1970s had, to put it as gently as possible, relaxed considerably, and genuine rust protection was frequently treated as something of an afterthought during manufacturing. Add a single hard winter's worth of road salt into the equation, and your gleaming, brand-new car would begin bubbling, blistering, and quietly flacking apart, starting from the fenders and working its way upward and outward from there. Cars barely a few years old routinely developed genuine holes you could see straight through to the moving road beneath. You didn't so much retire these cars in the traditional sense as you watched them slowly, steadily return to the raw earth they'd originally come from. Rust stood as the great, quiet shame of the entire decade, a slow-moving epidemic steadily eating away at American cars from the outside inward, and often from the inside outward as well. Bare steel left genuinely unprotected reacts readily with water and oxygen, and gradually turns into flaky orange decay. And the cars built throughout the 1970s were, in a great many documented cases, spectacularly unprotected against exactly this process. The factories did apply paint, and some amount of dedicated rust proofing, but frequently not nearly enough of it, not in all of the right places, and not always applied especially well. The bare metal was left genuinely vulnerable, and the surrounding environment proved more than happy to take full advantage of that vulnerability. The real villain in this particular story was road salt. In regions of the country with genuinely snowy winters, road crews spread salt liberally across the pavement to help melt accumulated ice. And that salt, mixed together with slush and standing water, ended up coating the underside and lower body panels of nearly every single car that drove through it. Salt dramatically accelerates the natural rusting process, and it worked its way steadily into every seam, every crevice, and every hidden pocket built into the car's underlying body structure, areas specifically prone to trapping moisture and salt together for long stretches of time. The lower fenders, the rocker panels running along the bottom edge of the doors, and the wheel arches all became, in effect, dedicated rust factories, quietly corroding away from within, hidden from view, until the damage had already progressed far beyond simple repair. And it happened remarkably fast, faster than most owners initially expected. This wasn't the slow, gradual decay that might unfold gently over several decades. Cars only a few years old could already show genuinely serious rust damage, bubbling up visibly underneath the paint like an unpleasant rash, blistering steadily along the fenders and the bottom edges of the doors. Left unaddressed, those small bubbles gradually turned into flakes. The flakes, in turn, gradually became genuine holes, and those holes continued spreading outward until entire sections of visible bodywork simply gave way. Fenders developed lacy, delicate-looking edges. Rocker panels crumbled away entirely. Floor pans rusted through completely in the worst documented cases, until a driver could genuinely see the pavement moving beneath their own feet through an actual hole where the solid floor used to be. The cruelest part of the whole arrangement was really how thoroughly it undercut everything else about the car. Here was this enormous, imposing, expensively optioned machine, dripping with chrome trim and velour upholstery and fake wood paneling throughout the cabin, and within just a few short years, it was quietly disintegrating around its own owner. All of that showroom glamour, all of that Brewem-branded luxury, rendered increasingly absurd by the slow orange decay steadily creeping upward from the wheel arches. A single car could genuinely have a plush, comfortable velour interior paired with an already rotting body underneath. A magnificent, imposing hood mounted above fenders you could poke a finger straight through. The rust, in the end, cared nothing at all about how fancy the trim happened to be. People fought back against all of this as best they reasonably could, and an entire small industry sprang up specifically around this particular ongoing battle. Aftermarket rust-proofing shops would spray thick waxy or tarry protective coatings deep into a car's hidden body cavities, promising, with varying degrees of honesty, to hold the encroaching decay at bay for a while longer. Owners touched up small rust bubbles themselves, patched over holes with body filler, and did their best to hide the accumulating damage for as long as reasonably possible before eventually selling the car along to someone else who would inevitably have to deal with the underlying problem soon enough. Some regions of the country, those spared the worst of the heavy road salt, managed to keep their cars running considerably longer as a direct result. While in the heavily salted regions, a typical car essentially came with a built-in shelf life from day one, a quiet countdown clock ticking steadily toward inevitable structural decay. In the end, rust, more than any single engine failure or mechanical fault, is genuinely what killed off the great majority of these cars. The engines themselves were sluggish, certainly, but generally quite durable and long-lasting. The bodies, plush and comfortable as they were, proved fundamentally doomed almost from the very beginning. Long before the mechanical components underneath ever gave out entirely, the body itself would rot away steadily beneath them, until the total cost of properly fixing all the accumulated holes finally exceeded the entire remaining value of the car, and it was sent off quietly to the scrapyard to be crushed flat. You didn't really wear these particular cars out through use so much as you simply watched them slowly dissolve, a gradual surrender to salt, standing water, and years of ordinary neglect. It was a genuinely magnificent machine carrying a fatal flaw baked directly into its very construction, gleaming proudly on the showroom floor while already, invisibly, beginning the long, slow journey back into the raw earth from which its steel had originally come. Let's talk now about how these cars were actually assembled in the first place, or, in a fairly surprising number of documented cases, how they simply weren't put together very well at all. This was the era of the infamous Monday car and Friday car, vehicles assembled by an overworked, understandably deflated factory workforce that had, quite reasonably, lost a fair amount of enthusiasm for the job at hand. Panel gaps wide enough to lose an entire finger inside. Trim pieces that came away entirely in your hand the moment you touched them. Switches that worked only when they personally felt like cooperating. You genuinely never quite knew exactly what you were going to get. Buying a brand new American car during this decade amounted, in a very real sense, to a genuine gamble, and the house, it must be said, did not always win gracefully. The phrase Monday car captured a real and widely believed phenomenon among ordinary buyers of the era. The underlying idea was that cars assembled on a Monday, when factory workers were often groggy and understandably resentful after the weekend, or on a Friday, when those same workers were distracted and actively rushing to get out the door toward it, tended to come off the line assembled with noticeably less overall care than cars built squarely in the middle of the working week. Whether the specific day of the week genuinely mattered in any measurable way or not, the underlying truth behind the folklore was very real indeed. Quality control along the assembly line was wildly inconsistent from car to car, and some vehicles simply came out measurably worse than others, riddled with small defects right from the very moment they first rolled off the factory floor. These defects took 1,000 different forms across the industry. Body panels frequently failed to line up correctly, leaving visible gaps that ran noticeably wide on one side of the car and uncomfortably tight on the other. Doors sat proud of the surrounding fender on one model and sank visibly below it on the very next example off the same line. Paint came out uneven in places, marred by visible runs, an unwanted orange peel texture, or patches that had simply been applied too thin. Trim pieces were frequently attached only loosely, and would rattle constantly over bumps or occasionally fall off entirely and land directly in your hand. Interior components squeaked and creaked steadily over every minor bump in the road, producing a kind of ongoing symphony of loose plastic parts. Switches and knobs worked only intermittently, or came away entirely in your fingers, or simply refused to do anything at all no matter how many times you tried them. Each individual car, in effect, amounted to its own small grab bag of unpredictable surprises. Some of this traced back fairly directly to the underlying economic and labor pressures of the era. Factories were being pushed hard to produce genuinely enormous production volumes, and the overall emphasis frequently fell on raw quantity over careful attention to detail. The relationship between plant management and the assembly line workforce was, in a great many documented cases, noticeably strained during this period. Morale on the line itself could run quite low, and a worker who felt little genuine pride in the finished product and little practical incentive to slow down and take extra care might reasonably let small flaws slide by unnoticed. Add in a fair amount of cost-cutting on raw materials and individual components, and the resulting finished product could genuinely feel thrown together in a hurry, an expensive machine assembled with something close to a resigned shrug. The overall result was that buying a brand new car became a genuinely unpredictable proposition for the average family. You might, with a bit of luck, get a genuinely good one, tightly assembled, solid, and largely trouble-free, and count yourself fortunate. Or you might instead get a genuine lemon, a car that seemed almost determined to fall apart piece by piece, requiring repeated dealer visits for one small nagging fault after another. Two seemingly identical cars, built on the very same assembly line only minutes apart, could end up with entirely different fates, one running reliably for years without complaint, the other rattling itself steadily to pieces within its very first year on the road. There was a genuine element of pure chance woven through the entire purchasing process, something close to a roll of the dice with every single new car bought. This ongoing inconsistency did lasting, measurable damage across the industry, and not merely to individual owners' wallets and personal patience. It steadily eroded broader public trust. When your genuinely expensive new American car began shedding trim pieces and developing mysterious rattles within only a few months of ownership, you remembered that experience clearly, and you told your friends and neighbors all about it. Meanwhile, the imported cars steadily arriving from overseas were busy building an entirely opposite reputation for themselves, one built around tight, careful assembly and a level of everyday reliability American buyers could genuinely count on. The contrast between the two experiences was stark, and ordinary buyers noticed it. Every single poorly assembled Monday car that rolled off a Detroit assembly line amounted, in effect, to a small, unintentional argument delivered directly to a frustrated customer in favor of buying something entirely different next time around. It stands as one of the era's great self-inflicted wounds. The cars themselves had genuine charm, real physical presence, real everyday comfort, and an authentic sense of character that a great many owners genuinely loved. But too often they simply weren't assembled especially well, and that underlying carelessness handed an enormous and largely unnecessary opening to overseas competitors who were, at the time, assembling their own cars with noticeably more care and consistency. The land yacht could win a buyer over completely in the showroom through its sheer size, its softness, and its abundant chrome trim, and then quietly lose that same buyer over the following months, one loose knob, one misaligned panel, and one mysterious rattle at a time. It was, for every single buyer, a genuine gamble taken at the point of purchase, and the frustrating thing, looking back, is that it never should have had to be a gamble at all. Let's discuss the color scheme now, because it can really only be honestly described as something close to a kitchen straight out of a mild fever dream. The 1970s loved one very specific, closely related family of colors above nearly all others: avocado green, harvest gold, and a particular shade of brown. The marketing departments insisted on calling something that sounded genuinely appetizing. Your brand new car could be ordered in the exact color of slightly aging guacamole. And a great many buyers chose that option entirely on purpose. Inside and out, everything on the car coordinated together into one warm, earthy, faintly nauseating overall harmony. It was a decade that looked directly at a bowl of split pea soup and thought, quite sincerely, yes, that's exactly the color we should be driving around in. To really understand this particular palette, you have to understand the broader cultural mood of the times. There was a widespread cultural turn taking place toward the earthy and the natural, a fairly deliberate rejection of the bright, cheerful pastel tones that had defined the previous decade or two, in favor of tones that felt, at least in theory, more grounded, more organic, more mature. The trouble was that grounded and organic in actual practice tended to mean the specific colors of things you might find near the bottom of a well-established compost heap: muddy greens, murky golds, deep gravy-toned browns, all of it earnest, all of it fairly dim, all of it strangely reminiscent of a well-used casserole dish left sitting out a little too long. The greens were, perhaps, the single most notorious color family of the entire decade. There existed a whole spectrum of them, ranging from a pale, somewhat sickly avocado all the way through to a deeper, richer olive, and they turned up seemingly everywhere at once: on cars, on kitchen refrigerators, on wall-to-wall carpeting, and on kitchen countertops alike. This was the exact shade of the classic avocado-colored kitchen appliance, the specific tone that would eventually become an instant, universally recognized visual shorthand for the entire decade. Choosing that particular color for your new car meant your enormous 2-ton land yacht now matched, quite literally, your kitchen, your bathroom fixtures, and quite possibly your favorite leisure suit as well, all humming quietly along together in the exact same warm, vegetal color key. The golds and yellows ran directly alongside the greens, that particular harvest gold shade sitting somewhere squarely between mustard and slightly old honey, dull and warm and faintly agricultural in its overall character. And then, finally, came the browns, an entire extended family of them, ranging from a light tan all the way through deep chocolate to a coppery rust brown, frequently given evocative, appetizing marketing names that made them sound, on paper, like fine cuts of meat or exotic imported spices. A dealer brochure would list a particular color with some rich, evocative name attached, and the actual finished car would arrive looking, in practice, exactly like a plain paper grocery bag left sitting out in the rain for a few hours. And crucially, the color coordination didn't stop at the paint itself. The real genius and genuine horror of the era lay in just how thoroughly it all coordinated together. You didn't simply get a brown car. You got a brown car fitted with a matching brown vinyl roof, a brown velour interior, brown carpeting underfoot, a brown dashboard, and even brown seat belts. The entire vehicle committed itself monochromatically to a single earthy tone, from the front bumper all the way back to the rear. Step inside a car ordered in gold, and you found yourself thoroughly bathed in gold from every direction, a warm, dim little cavern of perfectly matching upholstery and interior trim. The overall effect was genuinely immersive, thoroughly total, and after spending a while inside, faintly dizzying. Now, here's the genuinely strange part. People didn't merely tolerate these particular colors out of some sense of grudging necessity. They actively, enthusiastically loved them. This wasn't remotely a case of an unwanted palette being forced onto reluctant buyers against their will. Customers walked directly into showrooms and deliberately chose the avocado, the harvest gold, the deep autumnal brown, because those specific shades were, at the time, considered the genuinely fashionable, desirable, and sophisticated colors of the moment. What looks, to modern eyes decades later, almost like a punishment was, at the actual time, widely regarded as the very height of good taste. Fashion tends to work exactly that way. It convinces almost everyone all at once, with total sincerity, and then quietly abandons the whole group together, leaving them all wondering, years later, exactly what they'd been thinking. Because, of course, the broader cultural tide eventually turned, and it turned fairly hard. Within roughly a decade, these same warm, earthy tones would come to look impossibly, almost comically dated, and buyers would flee steadily toward crisp whites, cool grays, and bold reds instead. The avocado and harvest gold that had once seemed so genuinely tasteful became something close to a running punchline, the unmistakable visual signature of a decade that most people were, by then, quite ready to leave firmly behind them. But for its own particular moment in time, this really was considered the color of modern, forward-looking life, and America drove around cheerfully, quite convinced it had honestly never looked better. And who, in the end, is really in a position to say they were wrong? Every era looks a little strange from the outside looking in. Theirs simply happened to look strange in the exact coordinated colors of a lukewarm potluck buffet. Let's take a proper moment now for the mighty station wagon, the true family hauler of the entire era, and its single defining stylistic feature, fake wood paneling. Long panels of textured vinyl, printed to convincingly resemble genuine wood grain, ran down both sides of the car, fooling essentially nobody who looked closely, while somehow, against all logic, becoming genuinely beloved anyway. These wagons themselves were enormous, seating what felt like an entire small village's worth of passengers, frequently including a rear-facing third row of seating, where the family's children sat and stared directly backward at the drivers following behind them. There were, generally speaking, no seat belts back there worth seriously mentioning. There was only cargo space and a fairly generous amount of hope. The station wagon effectively served as the minivan and the SUV of its own particular day, the default family vehicle of choice for any household with young children and a lot of accumulated stuff that needed hauling around regularly. Took the long, low body of an already large American sedan and extended the roofline all the way back toward the rear, turning the trunk area into a vast, fully enclosed cargo hold complete with its own drop-down tailgate. The result was a vehicle of genuinely heroic overall length and total cargo capacity, capable of swallowing groceries, family luggage, furniture, the family dog, and an occasionally alarming number of squabbling children all at once, with real room still left to spare. And running down its flanks, in a great many cases, sat that unmistakable fake wood paneling. This was really the exact same trick used on the dashboard, simply scaled up considerably in size. Long panels of textured vinyl film, printed with a convincing wood grain pattern and frequently bordered with matching fake wood trim, applied directly to the sides of the car to evoke the classic, genuinely wood-bodied station wagons of decades earlier. Those much earlier wagons really had been built using actual wood, at considerable expense, and this vinyl version amounted to a fairly deliberate nostalgic nod toward that earlier heritage, a form of borrowed luxury by pure association, rendered here in ordinary adhesive plastic that would inevitably peel and fade under years of direct summer sun. The interior layout was built entirely around one single governing principle: maximum passenger and cargo capacity. 2 full rows of seating, and sometimes 3, could comfortably carry 6, 8, or even 9 people at once, depending on the exact configuration ordered. But the true crown jewel, The one feature that virtually every kid who rode in one still remembers vividly decades later was that rear-facing third row of seating. Tucked into the very back of the car, behind the standard second row, some wagons offered a fold-up bench seat that faced squarely backward, so that any children sitting there spent the entire trip looking directly out the rear window at whatever traffic happened to be following along behind them. You waved cheerfully at the drivers behind you, made faces at total strangers, and watched the surrounding world steadily recede as you were, in effect, towed backward down the highway for hours at a stretch. Safety considerations in that particular back seat were, to put it as gently and honestly as possible, fairly aspirational at best. That rear-facing seat sat positioned right at the very back of the entire car, squarely within the crumple zone, offering minimal protection, and it was frequently fitted with only the flimsiest of seat belts, if it was fitted with any belts at all. Children, quite routinely, rolled around loose in the open cargo area as a matter of ordinary daily routine, lying down flat in the very back to nap comfortably on long family road trips, climbing freely over the seats, generally treating the wagon's vast rear interior as something close to a mobile playroom on wheels. The entire arrangement operated on a level of casual, everyday risk that would genuinely horrify a modern parent today, and at the time, hardly anyone gave the matter a second thought at all. The station wagon effectively served as the central stage for the great American summer family road trip, that beloved seasonal ritual of packing everyone and everything the family owned into the wagon and setting off together across the country. Squabbling siblings crammed into the back seats. The family dog panting happily in the cargo hold. Extra luggage strapped down firmly to a roof rack up top. A determined father resolutely trying to make good time. A patient mother navigating carefully with an enormous, unwieldy paper road map spread across her lap. The wagon absorbed all of it without complaint, hauling the whole chaotic family enterprise steadily down endless stretches of highway, its fake wood paneling gleaming proudly in the sun, its rear-facing passengers cheerfully waving at total strangers the whole way. It was family life on wheels, captured in all of its cramped, bickering, thoroughly unbuckled glory. Its reign, sadly, wouldn't last forever. The station wagon would eventually be dethroned, first by the minivan and later still by the modern SUV, vehicles that ultimately did much the same everyday job, but with noticeably more usable space, and eventually, a great deal more built-in safety. But for a long, sustained stretch of years, the big, wood-paneled family wagon was simply what an ordinary American family drove, an established institution as much as it was a mere vehicle, and it continues to live on vividly in the memory of everyone who ever rode in one, especially those who spent long, warm summer afternoons tucked into that rear-facing seat, staring backward at an endless highway unspooling behind them, waving cheerfully at strangers. Sliding around loosely in the very back of a car roughly the size of a small ship, held in place by nothing more substantial than momentum and a fair amount of luck. Let's turn on the air conditioning now, an experience that, in most of these cars, offered you exactly two available settings and absolutely nothing in between. When the system actually worked properly, it worked with something close to the sheer ferocity of an Arctic gale, blasting out a solid wall of genuinely cold air, strong enough to frost your eyebrows and drop the entire cabin temperature down to something resembling a meat locker within a matter of seconds. When it didn't work properly, which happened rather more often than anyone would have liked, it produced instead a faint, warm, slightly damp sigh of air and a distinct smell reminiscent of a basement that hadn't been aired out in quite some time. There was, in practice, very little genuine middle ground between those two extremes. The system itself was large, heavy, and drained away what little remaining power the engine had left to offer. But on a genuinely hot summer day, you found yourself not caring in the slightest. You would rather freeze solid than merge slowly onto a highway while sweating through your shirt. Car air conditioning had technically existed for a good while before this particular decade, But the 1970s were really when it truly became something an ordinary middle-class family expected as standard, rather than treating it as some kind of exotic luxury reserved strictly for the wealthy. More and more cars began rolling out of American showrooms already fitted with it, and buyers who had once simply endured a hot summer with the windows rolled down and a damp cloth pressed against the back of their neck now demanded, quite reasonably, the small everyday miracle of cold air available at the flick of a switch. It represented a genuine and meaningful leap forward in everyday comfort, transforming the whole experience of driving through summer heat from something close to a genuine ordeal into something approaching, on a good day, actual pleasure. And when the system did run properly, it truly ran. These early air conditioning setups, once they finally got going, did not really do subtlety of any kind. They produced cold air, and a genuinely large amount of it, blasting frigid air directly out of the dashboard vents with real conviction and real force behind it. On a scorching summer afternoon, you could crank the system all the way up, and within a minute or two at most, transform the sweltering, sun-baked interior of your enormous land yacht into something fairly close to a functioning walk-in freezer. There was a certain brute force glory to the whole arrangement, a clear sense that if this particular machine was going to cool the cabin down at all, it was absolutely going to cool it down thoroughly, with subtlety and fine-grained control be entirely damned. The actual controls themselves were very much of their time, which is to say, fairly crude and remarkably confident about it. A handful of simple sliders or basic knobs. A fan speed setting that seemed to leap directly from barely on all the way to full hurricane force, with essentially no meaningful steps in between. Vents roughly the size of dinner plates that you aimed manually, by hand, in whatever general direction you preferred. There was very little in the way of fine, precise temperature adjustment available to the driver, no way to dial in a specific exact temperature the way a modern car allows. You essentially had cold, colder still, and fully off, and you managed the resulting cabin climate through a kind of ongoing personal negotiation with a system that held strong opinions of its own and offered remarkably few actual settings to work with. The real cost of all that frigid, glorious cooling power was paid, as it so often was throughout this decade, by the poor, already overworked engine. The air conditioning compressor itself was driven directly off the engine, and running it took a genuinely meaningful bite out of the car's already fairly meager available power reserves. Switch the AC on inside a big, already underpowered land yacht, and you could feel the noticeable difference almost immediately, the engine visibly bogging down further, the car growing even more sluggish than usual, acceleration fatting gradually from merely leisurely to something closer to purely theoretical. Merging onto a busy highway with the air conditioning running at full blast became a genuine act of faith. The engine now found itself split between the competing tasks of cooling you down and actually moving the car forward, and it struggled visibly at both jobs simultaneously. So you found yourself making a small choice, over and over again, all summer long: power or cold air. You could switch the AC off entirely to reclaim whatever small amount of extra pep the engine had left in reserve for a tricky highway merge or a steep uphill climb, and then switch the system back on again once you were safely up to speed, sweating quietly through the brief interval in between. Or alternatively, you could simply leave the AC running continuously and accept, as a matter of course, that you would be gloriously cool and noticeably, desperately slow, floating serenely along inside your own personal icy bubble while the surrounding traffic piled up impatiently behind you. On a genuinely hot day, most drivers, understandably, chose the cold air and simply let the merging sort itself out however it needed to. And when the system eventually broke down entirely, as these fairly complicated, hard-working mechanical systems inevitably did sooner or later, you were thrown right back into the pre-air-conditioned dark ages without warning. A dead AC system inside a car with a full vinyl and velour interior, sitting parked on a genuinely hot summer afternoon, amounted to real, honest misery. The cabin baking steadily in the sun, the seats growing uncomfortably hot to the touch, the only available relief coming from a rush of equally hot outside air pouring in through the open windows. Repairs to these systems tended to run fairly expensive, and the underlying components themselves were notoriously finicky and prone to failure. But when the system did work properly, it truly was magnificent, a solid wall of Arctic air available entirely on demand. And for an entire generation of drivers stepping into a genuinely cold car for the very first time on a blazing summer afternoon, it must have felt like nothing short of a small, everyday miracle. A slow, heavy, distinctly power-sapping miracle, admittedly, but a genuine miracle all the same. Let's find some music now, which means confronting head-on the actual state of the sound system. Your car very likely came equipped, as a matter of basic standard equipment, with a simple AM radio, offering up a small, tinny, entirely mono world of talk programming and top 40 hits, delivered through a single modest speaker mounted somewhere in the middle of the dashboard. If you'd spent a bit extra and gone slightly fancier, you might have an 8-track tape player fitted instead, a genuinely glorious brick of a machine that swallowed chunky plastic cartridges whole. The catch, and it was a fairly significant one, was that the 8-track format split your favorite albums up into oddly arranged chunks and would famously, reliably interrupt a song right in the middle of a note with a loud mechanical clunk as it switched between internal tracks. It was, at the time, considered the genuine future of in-car entertainment, and the whole system was, quite literally, held together with tape, of both the recording and the adhesive variety. The baseline listening experience for most ordinary drivers remained the basic AM radio, and it was, by modern standards, a genuinely humble affair. Amplitude modulation, radio carried its broadcast signal in a way that was distinctly prone to static interference, faded noticeably as you drove between the coverage areas of different stations, and delivered sound entirely in mono, through that single modest speaker mounted centrally in the dashboard. The overall audio quality was, charitably, merely functional. Music tended to sound thin and small through the system, but it reliably carried the daily news, live ball games, and the day's popular hit songs, and for the great majority of ordinary drivers over a long stretch of years, that was really considered entirely sufficient. You didn't listen to your car radio primarily for genuine sound fidelity. You listened to it, more than anything else, simply for company on the drive. FM radio, offering noticeably cleaner sound quality and true stereo capability, was steadily spreading across the industry during this same period, and it was available as an upgrade on the nicer trim levels. It represented a genuine, meaningful step up, richer and clearer in sound, and considerably better suited to actual music listening than standard AM. But the real coveted status symbol, the one feature that clearly marked out a truly modern and genuinely well-equipped car of the era, remained the 8-track tape player. For the very first time in automotive history, an ordinary driver could bring along their own personal choice of music, select their own favorite album, and play it back inside the car whenever they liked, freed at last from the ongoing tyranny of whatever a particular local radio station happened to be playing at any given moment. The 8-track cartridge itself was a genuinely chunky physical object, a fat plastic rectangle you slid firmly into a dedicated slot on the dashboard with a satisfying, solid clunk. Inside sat a continuous loop of magnetic tape, playing on an endless loop, internally divided into 4 separate programs. And this internal division is precisely where the trouble reliably began. Because the tape itself formed a continuous loop split into these separate sections, the player mechanism had to physically switch between sections as playback continued, and it did so with a loud, distinctly jarring ka-chunk sound, often landing right in the middle of a song at the worst possible moment. Your favorite track would be steadily building toward its musical climax, And then, ka-chunk. A brief moment of dead silence followed by a mechanical thud, and the song would resume playing, its careful mood thoroughly, irreversibly broken. This particular limitation meant that entire albums had to be deliberately rearranged by the record labels to properly fit the 8-track format. Their individual songs shuffled around into a different running order, and sometimes even artificially faded out and back in again, partway through a track, purely to accommodate the necessary program breaks built into the format. The specific listening experience originally intended by the recording artist was, in effect, chopped up and reordered entirely at the mercy of the tape loop's internal mechanics. You never really got to properly hear a record quite the way its original artist had actually intended it to be heard. You heard instead the 8-track version, complete with its jarring clunks, its rearranged running order, and its occasional favorite song rudely bisected right down the middle by an inconveniently timed program changeover. And you loved it anyway regardless, because it was, at long last, genuinely your own music playing inside your own car. The cartridges themselves also proved mechanically fragile in their own oddly charming way. The internal tape could stretch, warp, or jam up entirely inside the player mechanism, and a particularly beloved cartridge that got chewed up badly by a malfunctioning player represented a small, genuine personal tragedy. They also disliked heat intensely, and a parked car sitting in direct summer sun is, of course, essentially nothing but heat from roof to floor. So tapes carelessly left sitting out on the seat could easily warp into complete uselessness within a single hot afternoon. People commonly carried entire cardboard boxes of them, sliding around loosely on the floor and across the seats, a genuinely chaotic little traveling library of chunky plastic bricks, each individual cartridge representing its own small gamble on whether it would actually play back cleanly or instead emerge from the player thoroughly mangled beyond any hope of repair. The 8-track format's overall reign proved surprisingly brief in the end. Before too many more years had passed, the compact cassette tape arrived on the scene, noticeably smaller, considerably more mechanically reliable, and genuinely capable of holding an entire album in its proper original running order without any dreaded mid-song clunk interrupting the listening experience. It swept the bulkier 8-track format aside within just a few short years. The chunky plastic cartridge went, in a remarkably short span of time, from being the absolute cutting edge of automotive technology to becoming something close to an obsolete curiosity. But for its own particular moment in the sun, it genuinely represented the sound of personal freedom, the very first time an ordinary driver could truly choose their own soundtrack for a long highway drive, clunks and all. And anyone who ever actually owned one still remembers that distinctive sound clearly, decades later, the deep, resonant ka-chunk of the internal track changing, interrupting the music at exactly the worst possible moment again and again, and somehow, against all reasonable logic, still becoming a genuinely beloved part of the entire charm. Now let's talk about the decade's truly great communication craze, the Citizens Band radio, universally known simply as the CB. Suddenly, it seemed, everyone was bolting a small radio unit underneath their dashboard, adopting a colorful personal nickname known as a handle, and chattering away happily to complete strangers about traffic conditions and hidden police speed traps, all conducted in a rich, colorful slang entirely its own. Truckers, of course, used the system quite seriously as an essential everyday working tool. Nearly everyone else took it up largely because a wildly popular hit song and a hugely successful movie had, almost overnight, made the whole thing feel genuinely, irresistibly cool. Breaker, breaker, what's your 20? Is there a smoky lurking up ahead somewhere? It amounted, in effect, to an early form of social media, delivered entirely through a curly cord, and featuring a genuinely remarkable number of references to bears supposedly lurking somewhere out on the open road. The Citizens Band radio was, at its core, a fairly simple two-way radio system, allowing drivers within a few miles of one another to talk freely back and forth over a shared set of designated channels. It had technically existed for a good number of years already as a purely practical working tool, but during the 1970s, it exploded almost overnight into a genuine nationwide cultural obsession. Part of the underlying trigger was really that new 55-mile-per-hour national speed limit, combined with the ongoing fuel shortages of the period. Truckers had long used these radios to warn one another in real time about exactly where police officers happened to be waiting with radar guns, and about which gas stations along a given route still had fuel actually available. What had begun as a purely practical working tool for people who drove professionally for a living quickly caught on with everybody else as well, because the underlying appeal was both obvious and genuinely enormous. Here, suddenly, was a simple way to talk directly to total strangers, to feel like part of an invisible community drifting up and down the same stretch of highway together, to receive real-time information about traffic conditions and road hazards, and above all, to learn exactly where the police happened to be lurking at that particular moment with their radar guns aimed and ready. In an era that existed well before mobile phones, well before any of the connected digital technology we now largely take for granted, the CB radio genuinely felt like something close to magic. A disembodied voice emerging from your own dashboard, a real functioning link to other people out there somewhere in the dark, all quietly sharing the exact same stretch of road with you. And then, of course, there was the specialized slang, which was really half the entire fun of the whole experience. CB users across the country developed an entire rich, playful private vocabulary of their own, one that made every single conversation feel a bit like participating in some kind of secret shared code. Police officers were bears, or sometimes smokies, in reference to their distinctive wide-brimmed hats. Your current physical location was your 20. You asked other users to break in on a busy channel when you wanted to join an ongoing conversation, and nearly everyone signed off at the end of a chat with cheerful, established catchphrases of their own. Drivers adopted colorful personal handles, essentially nicknames they used exclusively on the air, giving themselves an entirely separate alternate identity specifically for the open highway. Ordinary, everyday commuters suddenly got to play, at least for a little while, at being part of a much larger, genuinely romantic trucker subculture, talking the talk and briefly living out a character straight from a popular road movie, because that's precisely what had fueled the entire craze in the first place: mainstream popular culture. A hugely popular hit song specifically about truckers and their CB radio adventures, a string of successful movies celebrating the romantic, outlaw spirit of the open road, and the growing citizens band community all combined together to turn the CB radio from a purely practical device into a genuine nationwide cultural phenomenon. Suddenly, the radio wasn't merely useful anymore. It was cool. It was glamorous. It became a genuine accessory that connected an ordinary driver to the entire freewheeling mythology of the American open highway. Sales boomed dramatically across the country. The available channels grew increasingly crowded with chatter, and something close to half the cars on any given road sprouted the distinctive tall whip antenna that marked out a properly equipped CB rig. The reality of it all, once absolutely everyone had piled enthusiastically in, turned out to be gloriously chaotic in practice. The available channels became crowded and genuinely noisy, a constant cacophony of overlapping voices, idle chatter, occasional nonsense, and buried somewhere in the middle of it all, the occasional genuinely useful piece of information. Finding a genuinely clear channel to talk on became, in itself, something of a real challenge. The airwaves amounted, in practice, to a crowded, anarchic party line where seemingly everyone talked at once, and nobody in particular was ever quite in charge. It was messy, cluttered, and often not especially useful in any practical sense. And that, somehow, was very much part of the underlying charm as well, the palpable sense of a rowdy, shared public space, full of strangers and colorful personalities all talking at once. Like all genuine crazes eventually do, this one burned brightly for a while and then gradually faded away. The novelty steadily wore off over time. The channels remained cluttered, and eventually newer communication technologies would come along offering considerably better ways to stay in touch and navigate unfamiliar roads. The great CB radio boom of the mid-1970s eventually subsided, leaving the radios largely to the professional truckers and dedicated hobbyist enthusiasts who had genuinely used them all along, long before the craze ever began. But for a few genuinely intense years there in the middle of the decade, the Citizens Band radio truly was the sound of the American open road, an entire nation of ordinary drivers chattering happily away to one another in playful shared code, warning each other about hidden speed traps, swapping colorful handles, and feeling, for the length of a single car trip, genuinely connected to everyone else out there together in the great, sprawling, rolling community of the American highway. It was a strange and, in its own way, genuinely wonderful little moment in cultural history, and it lived entirely inside a device roughly the size of a small lunchbox, bolted underneath the dashboard, quietly crackling away with the voices of complete strangers. Let's look down now at the wheels themselves, because the 1970s dressed them up with a genuine, unwavering sense of commitment. Wide whitewall tires, ringed with a broad band of bright white rubber that stood as a real symbol of everyday respectability, were frequently paired together with fake wire wheel covers, stamped out of shiny plastic and chrome specifically to imitate the look of genuinely expensive spoked wheels. Some cars, taking the whole affair a step further still, added fender skirts, curved metal panels that covered over the top portion of each rear wheel opening for a smooth, elegant, unbroken profile, a styling choice that also happened to make the simple act of changing a flat tire into something close to a genuine ordeal. None of it, taken together, actually made the car go any faster or handle any better. All of it, without exception, made the car look thoroughly dressed up for church. The whitewall tire itself formed the visual foundation of this entire look, and it carried a genuinely long-standing heritage of respectability behind it. A distinct band of bright white rubber running around the outer sidewall of an otherwise all-black tire, standing out crisply against both the dark rubber of the tire itself and the dark asphalt of the road beneath it, lending the entire car a clean, formal, unmistakably dressed-up appearance. Wide white walls in particular carried a certain traditional dignity all their own, serving as the recognizable mark of a properly equipped full-size car, driven by a properly responsible adult. They also, inevitably, showed off every single speck of accumulated road dirt with real clarity, and required fairly regular scrubbing with specialized cleaning products just to keep them looking properly bright and presentable. A small, ongoing weekly chore performed entirely in the service of looking genuinely sharp. On top of the tires themselves went the wheel covers, and here the entire decade's love of decorative illusion truly reached its fullest flower. Genuine wire-spoke wheels, featuring many thin individual metal spokes, were expensive to manufacture, elegantly refined in appearance, and strongly associated at the time with fine imported European automobiles. So Detroit, quite naturally, did exactly what Detroit did best throughout this entire era. It faked the whole look convincingly. Stamped plastic and chrome-plated wheel covers were carefully manufactured to closely imitate the intricate, many-spoked look of genuine wire wheels, snapping directly over an underlying set of plain steel wheels to create a convincing overall impression of considerably more expensive hardware, all at a small fraction of the actual manufacturing cost. From a few feet away, out on the street, they looked genuinely, thoroughly convincing. Up close, under direct examination, they were unmistakably plastic, and they had a well-documented habit of popping cleanly off the wheel and rolling away down the street the moment you hit even a moderately sized pothole. Then, finally, there were the fender skirts, perhaps the single most fully committed styling choice among all of these decorative flourishes. These were curved metal panels specifically designed to cover over the upper portion of each rear wheel opening, effectively hiding the top of the rear tire from view entirely, and creating in the process a smooth, unbroken, flowing visual line running continuously along the entire side of the car. The overall visual effect was, it has to be said, genuinely elegant, sleek, and formal in character, precisely the kind of clean, uninterrupted profile that suited a big, dignified, full-size sedan rather well. And for the purposes of simply looking good while parked at the curb, or gliding serenely down a wide boulevard, it genuinely worked quite beautifully. The practical cost of all that carefully cultivated elegance revealed itself rather abruptly the very moment you actually got a flat tire on one of the rear wheels. With a fender skirt fully covering the rear wheel opening, you couldn't simply jack the car up and swap the tire in the ordinary, straightforward way. You first had to remove the entire skirt panel, which was frequently held in place with fussy, hard-to-reach fasteners that corroded steadily over time, stuck stubbornly in place, and generally fought you at every single step of the process. Changing a rear flat tire on a fully skirted car, stranded by the side of the road, particularly in the rain, became something close to a genuine wrestling match against a purely decorative panel that had absolutely no interest in coming off easily. Beauty, as always seemed to be the case throughout this particular decade, demanded a certain amount of genuine suffering in exchange. All of this considerable ornamentation shared, at its core, the exact same underlying purpose, and it really was the same underlying purpose driving so much of the era's overall automotive design: to look expensive, formal, and appropriately dignified, largely regardless of what actually lay underneath all that careful presentation. The white walls, the fake wire wheel covers, the smooth, skirted rear flanks, none of it genuinely improved how the car actually drove, stopped, or held up structurally over time. It was, in every meaningful sense, entirely surface level, entirely about outward presentation. A car deliberately dressing itself up in the established visual language of old-world luxury and tradition. The plain steel wheel hiding underneath that fake wire cover was, in reality, about as basic and unadorned as a wheel could possibly be. The entire point was really the cover itself, the carefully cultivated impression it created, the overall look from clear across a parking lot, and it fit perfectly with the whole broader design philosophy of the era's cars. These were machines specifically built to be seen, to actively project status, taste, and a certain formal respectability at every turn, and every single detail, right down to the wheels themselves, served that same overarching goal. The car remained, in effect, permanently dressed for a special occasion, a rolling exercise in looking considerably finer than it actually was underneath. It wasn't genuinely fast, and it certainly wasn't especially sporty, and it definitely wasn't particularly practical the moment you actually got a flat tire. But parked comfortably at the curb, fully dressed in all of its decorative finery, it looked, in every meaningful sense, every single inch the dignified luxury machine it was earnestly pretending to be. And in the 1970s, that particular pretending really was, in a very real sense, the entire point. Let's pull one out now for the American muscle car, because this was really the decade that quietly, methodically strangled it. Only a few short years earlier, cheap gasoline combined with genuinely enormous engines had given the country some truly glorious tire-shredding monsters. Then came the tightening emissions regulations. Then came insurance companies steadily raising their rates on essentially anything built for speed. Then came the oil crisis, which made owning raw horsepower feel, almost overnight, genuinely irresponsible. One by one, the era's legendary performance engines were choked down through emissions equipment, deliberately detuned for cleaner running, or simply discontinued outright and dropped entirely from the lineup. The cars themselves kept their aggressive model names and their bold racing stripes right through to the very end. They simply no longer had anything genuine left underneath to back any of it up. The muscle car had truly represented the glory of the late 1960s, a beautifully simple underlying idea taken to its most thrilling possible extreme. Take an otherwise ordinary midsize car, drop in the single largest, most powerful engine you could reasonably fit under the hood, and then sell the whole package fairly cheaply to young buyers who wanted, more than almost anything else, to go genuinely fast. The result was a genuine golden age of raw, remarkably affordable performance. Cars fitted with genuinely monstrous engines and a correspondingly brash attitude, tearing up drag strips and ordinary city streets alike. Gasoline was cheap and freely available. Engine designs remained largely unregulated, and the ongoing horsepower wars between competing manufacturers steadily pushed the published numbers ever higher, year after year. It was loud. It was, by any reasonable measure, genuinely reckless. And it was, in its own particular way, absolutely wonderful. Then the 1970s arrived, and one powerful force after another proceeded to systematically kill the whole thing off. First came the new emissions regulations, the clean air rules that demanded engines pollute measurably less than before, and the fairly crude available technology of the era achieved that reduction largely by choking the engines down considerably, robbing them of precisely the raw power that had defined them in the first place. The once mighty performance engines, now strangled by mandatory emissions equipment and deliberately detuned for cleaner overall running, saw their published output figures collapse dramatically within just a handful of model years. The exact same underlying engine that had produced genuinely stirring, visceral power only a year or two earlier now produced merely a faint shadow of that same power, wheezing along where it had once roared with real authority. Then came the insurance companies, and their particular blow, while considerably quieter, proved every bit as deadly to the segment in the end. They had noticed, through careful actuarial analysis, that young male drivers piloting genuinely powerful cars tended to crash them with expensive and remarkably predictable regularity, and they responded to that pattern by raising insurance premiums on high-performance cars to genuinely punishing levels. Suddenly, the once affordable muscle car wasn't affordable at all anymore in any meaningful practical sense. The car itself might still technically sit within reach financially, but the cost of properly insuring it proved genuinely ruinous for most young buyers. The entire underlying appeal of the segment had always rested on the idea of cheap, accessible speed for younger buyers, and once actually insuring the thing came to cost a small fortune every single year, that core appeal simply evaporated for most people almost overnight. The target customer could, quite literally, no longer afford to own the dream. And then came the final decisive blow, the 1973 oil crisis. With fuel suddenly expensive and genuinely scarce across the entire country, the whole underlying idea of owning a thirsty, powerful engine shifted, seemingly overnight, from being genuinely exciting to feeling something close to embarrassing. Raw horsepower itself began to feel, in the cultural mood of the moment, distinctly irresponsible. Guzzling fuel felt, to a great many ordinary Americans, almost shameful. And a car deliberately built entirely around one big, hungry engine was, in every practical sense, exactly the wrong car to be seen driving at exactly the wrong cultural moment. The broader cultural winds had shifted hard and fast against pure performance, and the muscle car, already thoroughly choked by tightening regulations and effectively priced out of reach by soaring insurance costs, found itself suddenly, completely out of step with an entire nation that had abruptly become obsessed with fuel economy above nearly everything else. What actually survived this triple onslaught was a strange, hollow echo of the real, original thing. Manufacturers largely kept many of the segment's most famous performance names alive on the order sheet, kept the aggressively sporty styling cues, the hood scoops, the bold racing stripes, the muscular overall stance. But underneath the hood itself, the genuine fire was, in most cases, simply gone entirely. These particular cars looked genuinely fast standing perfectly still in a parking lot, and were, in practice, anything but fast once actually out on the road. Their once genuinely fearsome engines now detuned down to modest, wheezing output figures. They wrote performance checks that their own engines could no longer realistically cash. All swagger and bold attitude, and remarkably little actual acceleration to back any of it up. The slow, quiet death of the classic muscle car marked, in a very real sense, the genuine end of an entire era. The gradual closing of a brief historical window during which raw, genuinely cheap, largely unregulated horsepower had been readily available to perfectly ordinary young buyers. It would not, in that particular original form, ever really return. When genuine automotive performance eventually did make its way back decades later, it would arrive through an entirely different set of underlying technologies, cleaner, considerably more sophisticated, and built around principles that had nothing to do with brute displacement alone. But the classic muscle car, that wonderfully simple, brutally straightforward recipe of a genuinely big engine stuffed into a genuinely cheap car, was very much a creature of its own specific historical moment, and the 1970s snuffed that particular moment out entirely through a combination of tightening regulation, shifting economics, and a broader cultural change in underlying values. The racing stripes remained on the order sheet. The hood scoops remained as an available option. The overall swagger in a purely visual sense remained fully intact. The actual muscle itself, quietly and quite completely, was simply gone. Let's admire for a moment the true reigning king of the entire decade, the personal luxury coupe. These were enormous two-door cars, fitted with genuinely tiny back seats, endless sweeping hoods, thickly padded vinyl roofs, and model names that sounded, more than anything else, like a line of men's cologne. This was the full flowering era of Brougham everything, of velvet-soft interiors, glowing opera lamps, and a smooth, reassuring television pitchman purring at length about genuinely fine, soft leather upholstery. These cars weren't fast. They weren't remotely practical, and they certainly weren't especially sensible by any conventional measure. They were pure, unapologetic style, packaged and sold, and America bought them quite happily by the millions. If the muscle car had been the fallen king of the previous decade, the personal luxury coupe was very much the new ruler that rose up to take its place, and it captured the genuinely changed cultural mood of the era almost perfectly. Where the muscle car had always been fundamentally about speed and youthful aggression, the personal luxury coupe was about comfort, personal style, and outward status instead. It offered an ordinary, middle-class buyer a real taste of luxury, of feeling genuinely special, of arriving somewhere in a car that quietly announced you had done rather well for yourself, all without the truly staggering expense of an actual top-tier luxury automobile. It amounted, in effect, to affordable prestige, carefully packaged and sold at scale, and the underlying formula proved wildly, enormously successful across the entire industry. The overall shape of these cars was distinctive, and more than a little absurd if you stopped to really look closely. These were long, low, two-door coupes fitted with hoods that seemed to stretch on forever ahead of the driver, an expanse of painted sheet metal wildly out of proportion, with anything genuinely mechanical actually sitting underneath it. That long, sweeping hood signaled importance, power, and real presence, even when the engine tucked beneath it was, in reality, the exact same tamed, thoroughly choked unit found underneath the hood of a far more humble, ordinary sedan. Behind the driver, the cabin itself proved surprisingly cramped and tight. The back seat, more often than not, amounted to little more than a token gesture, narrow and genuinely awkward to actually sit in, because these particular cars were fundamentally designed around the front seat experience and the overall outward visual impression they created, rather than around any real practical ability to comfortably carry rear passengers. Inside, these coupes went all in, without hesitation, on plush, indulgent luxury. This was, in every sense, genuine Brougham territory, the deepest, softest, most heavily tufted interiors the entire decade was capable of producing. Swathed generously in velour or occasionally genuine leather, dotted throughout with fake wood trim, glowing softly here and there with small decorative courtesy lamps. Every single surface inside was padded, every last detail carefully aimed at making the occupant feel thoroughly pampered and genuinely important. The seats themselves felt more like plush armchairs than ordinary car seats. The ride quality was floaty and deliberately isolating, and the entire cabin wrapped you up snugly in a warm cocoon of soft, quiet, faintly ridiculous everyday luxury. It amounted, in effect, to a rolling living room, carefully designed to make you feel, at all times, like someone who had genuinely arrived in life. The exterior details piled on absolutely every single luxury cue the decade had managed to invent up to that point: padded vinyl roofs, opera windows, matching opera lamps, chrome trim seemingly everywhere you looked, a prominent hood ornament standing proudly at the very end of that impossibly long hood, fake wire wheel covers, wide whitewall tires. Each individual car amounted, in effect, to a fairly complete catalog of the era's favorite decorative flourishes, every single one of them carefully chosen to signal refinement and genuine expense to anyone glancing over. And then, of course, there were the model names themselves, genuinely wonderful names, evocative words carefully chosen to suggest elegance, sophistication, and a certain continental sense of class. Badges that sounded, more than anything, like the names of fine imported fragrances or exclusive private resorts, all deliberately designed to lend an unmistakable air of prestige to what was, underneath it all, still a fairly ordinary mass-produced coupe. The advertising campaigns of the era sold this particular dream directly, openly, and without a hint of embarrassment. This was the golden age of the smooth, reassuring television pitchman, describing the sumptuous, deeply cushioned interior in warm, reverent tones, of advertising that promised buyers not mere basic transportation, but a genuine experience, a real personal elevation, a distinct sense of having genuinely made it in the wider world. The cars themselves were sold, first and foremost, on feeling, on carefully cultivated image, on the appealing fantasy of the successful, genuinely discerning owner gliding serenely through everyday life wrapped in quiet, padded comfort. And it worked, quite honestly, extraordinarily well across every demographic. Buyers responded to that carefully packaged fantasy in genuinely enormous numbers, and the personal luxury coupe became, by a comfortable margin, one of the best-selling and most defining vehicle types of the entire decade. Of course, judged by any genuinely practical measure, these cars made remarkably little sense on paper. They were enormous on the outside and noticeably cramped on the inside, thirsty at the pump and sluggish on the road, all outward style and carefully cultivated image over any real underlying substance. But that, in the end, was really and entirely the point. Nobody bought a personal luxury coupe expecting to be sensible about the purchase. They bought one specifically to feel genuinely special, to project outward success to friends and neighbors alike, to wrap themselves comfortably in soft velour and glide serenely down the road inside a long, low, chrome-laden rolling statement announcing, without a single spoken word, that they had truly arrived. It represented in many ways the purest possible expression of what the American car of the 1970s was really and truly about, deep down. Not going especially fast, not being especially practical, but looking and genuinely feeling thoroughly magnificent behind the wheel, and at that particular goal it succeeded in the end almost completely. Let's glance now, a little nervously, toward the growing competition, because something genuinely small was quietly happening in driveways scattered right across America. Compact, remarkably efficient cars from Japan and from West Germany were steadily arriving on American shores in growing numbers, and following the oil crisis, they suddenly began to make a very great deal of practical sense to ordinary buyers. They were reliable in daily use. They sipped fuel carefully rather than guzzling it, and they simply didn't dissolve into rust at the very first sign of a harsh winter. Detroit, confident and enormous as ever, largely waved these smaller competitors off as little more than a passing fad. That particular confidence would, in the end, age about as gracefully as a peeling vinyl roof left out in the summer sun. For years leading up to this point, imported cars had occupied only a small, easily dismissed corner of the overall American automotive market. They were treated, by most ordinary buyers, as odd, faintly foreign curiosities, driven mainly by people with unusual, slightly eccentric personal tastes, and Detroit's major manufacturers paid them remarkably little serious attention as a result. American automakers were, at the time, genuine industrial giants, dominant and entirely secure in their position, building enormous cars for a domestic public that seemed, at least outwardly, to want essentially nothing else. The idea that these comparatively small foreign machines might pose any real, serious threat to the mighty American automobile industry would have struck most industry insiders, at the very start of the decade, as almost genuinely laughable. But the imported cars had, quite quietly, been steadily getting better throughout this period, and then the sudden oil crisis handed them the perfect opening they needed to break through in a major way. Here, suddenly, were cars that were small, comparatively light, and genuinely economical to run day to day, sipping fuel carefully at exactly the moment the domestic land yachts were guzzling it wastefully. In a world now defined by long gas lines and rapidly soaring fuel prices, a car that reliably went considerably further on a comparatively small amount of gasoline was no longer some eccentric, faintly odd choice. It had become, almost overnight, an obviously smart and sensible one. The very same qualities that had once made these smaller cars seem genuinely insignificant in the marketplace suddenly, quite dramatically, became their single greatest selling point. Buyers, understandably rattled by recent events, began taking a genuinely fresh look at these smaller imports, and they generally liked what they found there. And it wasn't merely the improved fuel economy driving the shift, either. The imported cars were, in a great many documented cases, simply and measurably better built overall. While American manufacturers continued struggling with inconsistent assembly quality, persistent rattles, and the well-known Monday car problem discussed earlier, a great many of these imports arrived on dealer lots tightly assembled, carefully finished, and reliably capable of running for years on end with only minimal mechanical trouble. In a domestic market where buyers had grown quietly frustrated with the inconsistent quality of their own genuinely expensive domestic cars, this particular contrast proved both immediately striking and thoroughly persuasive to a great many shoppers. These imports also tended to resist America's great ongoing rust epidemic considerably better in a great many documented cases, and they were frequently more genuinely pleasant to actually drive day to day as well, being noticeably lighter on their feet, more nimble through corners, and considerably more responsive to driver input than the big, floaty, wallowing land yachts most Americans had grown accustomed to. The whole overall package added up to a genuinely compelling argument for a growing number of buyers. Where the classic American car offered sheer size, deliberate softness, and carefully cultivated visual image, the typical import instead offered fuel economy, day-to-day reliability, and a tighter, noticeably more honest overall driving experience. For a steadily growing number of American buyers, particularly in the direct aftermath of the oil crisis, that particular trade-off suddenly began to look genuinely, seriously attractive. Detroit's initial response to all of this proved, at first, dangerously complacent. The dominant American manufacturers largely dismissed the growing import threat outright, remaining confident in their own established size, their deep industrial heritage, and their long-standing assumption that ordinary American buyers would always, in the end, prefer big American cars above all else. When domestic manufacturers finally did attempt to respond with their own smaller compact models, those particular efforts were frequently rushed to market, poorly assembled, and ultimately unconvincing to skeptical buyers, doing considerably more in practice to confirm the import's growing advantages than to genuinely counter them in any meaningful way. The established giants proved remarkably slow to take the underlying threat seriously, and with every passing year that they continued to hesitate, the imports grew steadily stronger, more firmly established in the marketplace, and considerably more widely trusted by ordinary American consumers. This quiet, gradual shift represented the genuine beginning of an enormous structural transformation, one that would go on to fundamentally reshape the entire American car industry over the coming decades. The small foreign cars that Detroit had so confidently waved off during the 1970s would eventually grow into major, formidable industrial forces of their own, steadily capturing an ever larger share of the domestic American market, until the industry dominance that had once seemed so thoroughly unshakable was, in time, quite thoroughly broken. The seeds of that much larger transformation were planted right there, quietly, in the long gas lines, in the mounting quality complaints, and in the fresh, careful calculations being made by ordinary buyers all across the country. The great American land yacht still ruled the road for the time being, enormous and outwardly confident as ever. But something small, efficient, and genuinely well-built had already appeared quite clearly in the rearview mirror, and it was steadily gaining ground, while Detroit, for the moment, was barely watching. Finally, let's watch this particular era begin, slowly and reluctantly, to draw to a close. Late in the decade, stung badly by soaring fuel prices and steadily mounting foreign competition, Detroit finally did the genuinely unthinkable and began shrinking its own flagship cars. Almost overnight, by the standards of a normally slow-moving industry, the great full-size land yachts of the earlier 1970s were carefully downsized into something noticeably smaller, appreciably lighter, and, whisper it quietly, considerably more sensible than before. The entire age of the 18-foot living room on wheels was, in effect, quietly closing its own doors for good. Your enormous, thirsty, rust-prone, wonderfully absurd machine was steadily becoming something of a historical relic, and an entirely new and rather different kind of American car was already, quietly, pulling into the family driveway to take its place. The underlying pressures driving this shift had, by this point, simply become impossible for the industry to continue ignoring. The oil crisis had thoroughly shattered the long-standing illusion of endlessly cheap, freely available fuel. New federally mandated fuel economy standards were actively being imposed across the industry, demanding that cars travel meaningfully further on every single gallon of gasoline. And the steadily growing imports continued eating away at Detroit's traditional market share with their smaller, more efficient, and noticeably better-built offerings. The old, familiar formula, ever bigger, ever heavier, ever thirstier, had finally run headlong into an entirely new economic and cultural reality, and it simply could not reasonably continue in that same form. Something fundamental clearly had to give. So the major manufacturing giants of Detroit did something that would have seemed genuinely unthinkable to most industry observers only a few short years earlier. They deliberately made their flagship cars smaller, and they did it entirely on purpose. In a broad, coordinated wave of downsizing that swept across the entire domestic industry, the once enormous full-size models were carefully redesigned from the ground up to be noticeably shorter, appreciably narrower, and in many cases, dramatically lighter than before, shedding hundreds of pounds and a considerable amount of overall length in the process, while genuinely trying hard to preserve as much usable interior passenger room as possible along the way. It represented, in a great many documented cases, a genuine and impressive engineering achievement, successfully packaging nearly the same amount of usable interior space into a substantially smaller, considerably more efficient overall body. The results, understandably, felt genuinely strange at first to a domestic public that had grown thoroughly accustomed to the old, established excess. A properly downsized full-size car of this new generation looked almost modest sitting next to its own enormous predecessor, and ordinary buyers found themselves having to steadily adjust their entire long-standing sense of what a proper, respectable American car was actually supposed to look like. But the smaller, considerably lighter cars genuinely made sense in a way the old land yachts simply no longer did by this point in the decade. They used noticeably less fuel per mile driven. They were easier, by a wide margin, to park and maneuver through tight city streets. And critically, they lost remarkably little of the essential everyday comfort that had always been the entire underlying point of the American car in the first place. The transition itself proved genuinely jarring for a great many long-time buyers, but the underlying logic behind it was, by this point, simply undeniable. It marked, in every meaningful sense, the genuine close of one very particular, distinctive chapter in the broader American automotive story. The end of an era when a car could reasonably be enormous, genuinely thirsty, deliberately soft, and gloriously impractical simply because that particular combination happened to be exactly what ordinary people wanted, back when fuel remained cheap enough to comfortably allow for all of it. The specific character of the classic 1970s land yacht, that unique and unmistakable combination of vast physical size, plush interior excess, deliberately weak engines, and total everyday indifference toward fuel economy, was very much a product of its own exact historical moment. And as that particular moment gradually passed into history, so too did the distinctive cars that had come to define it so completely. Detroit, in the years that followed, would never quite build them in that same particular way again. And there was, in the end, something genuinely a little poignant buried in that particular passing. For all of their considerable absurdity, these enormous cars had real, undeniable character, a certain confidence and genuine generosity of overall scale, and everyday comfort that later, more conventionally sensible cars would, in many respects, come to noticeably lack. They were flawed in 100 different documented ways, sluggish and genuinely thirsty, distinctly prone to rust, and frequently inconsistently assembled on the factory floor. But they were also, at the very same time, genuinely spacious, remarkably comfortable, thoroughly distinctive in appearance, and unmistakably, completely of their own particular time in American history. They represented, in their own strange way, a very particular kind of post-war American optimism, a deep-seated cultural belief in bigness, in comfort, and in everyday abundance, rendered quite literally in 2 full tons of chrome-laden, velour-lined steel. So, as the decade finally drew to its close, and the newly downsized cars steadily rolled into showrooms across the country to replace them, the great American land yacht drifted quietly, gradually into automotive history, replaced in time by machines that were noticeably smaller, considerably smarter in their engineering, and far more genuinely attuned to an American world that had, in the space of only a few short years, changed dramatically and permanently. The strange, magnificent, deeply flawed automobiles of the 1970s had, in the end, one final quiet gift left to offer, and that gift was simply to mark, through their own gradual passing, the genuine end of one distinctive American era and the quiet, uncertain beginning of another one entirely. And somewhere out there, in driveways scattered right across the country, a newly downsized car now sat parked in the exact spot where an enormous land yacht used to sit, noticeably more sensible in nearly every measurable way, and just a little bit less magnificent to look at. So there you have it. You've spent this long, quiet evening riding along inside the American automobile at its strangest, most excessive, and most genuinely lovable, and what a remarkable, sprawling machine it truly was. You woke up somewhere in the middle of the decade, sank comfortably into a velour bench seat roughly the size of a small sofa, and pumped the gas pedal through some small, hopeful personal ritual, while a stubborn carburetor quietly decided whether or not it felt like cooperating that particular morning. You floated serenely down the open highway inside 2 full tons of gleaming chrome and carefully applied fake wood trim, steering something that handled, more than anything, like a large waterbed, and stopping only whenever the car itself eventually got around to it. You watched the fuel gauge slowly sink, sat patiently through the long gas lines, and quietly paid the accumulated price for a car that had been built as though cheap fuel would simply keep flowing forever without interruption. It was, by almost every conventional measure, a genuinely deeply flawed machine. The engines were enormous in physical size, and yet, somehow, largely gutless underneath, choked nearly to death by their own tangled emissions plumbing. The bumpers could reportedly survive a genuine collision with a small asteroid, while the body itself quietly rusted clean through within only a few short winters of ordinary use. The overall build quality amounted to a genuine gamble with every single purchase. The fuel economy was, by any measure, something close to a running punchline, and the whole magnificent, sprawling barge was already, in a very real sense, going out of fashion before most owners had even finished paying it off in full. The imports were steadily gaining ground in the rearview mirror the whole time. The land yachts themselves were already shrinking by decade's end, and the entire glorious, excessive era was, even then, quietly drifting toward its own inevitable close. And yet, there was genuinely something wonderful buried in all of that documented absurdity. These were cars built with real confidence and real generosity of spirit, cars that sincerely believed everyday comfort mattered more than strict practical sense, and that bigger, in the end, really was simply better. They wrapped their owners in soft, comfortable seats and small glowing courtesy lamps, gave you genuine room to stretch out and a hood long enough to comfortably land a small aircraft on, and asked remarkably little of you in return beyond simply enjoying the ride while it lasted. They were ridiculous, by nearly every objective measure, and on some level they clearly knew it themselves, and they remained, against all odds, genuinely magnificent anyway. So tonight, as you finally settle into your own bed, in a world full of modern cars that reliably start every single time, that sip their fuel carefully, and that generally don't quietly rust away entirely beneath their own owners, maybe spare a small, warm thought for those enormous, thirsty, beautifully impractical machines of an earlier American decade. They carried their owners serenely down endless stretches of open highway through a decade that has never quite been fully repeated since. Because history, in the end, isn't only ever made up of wars and kings and grand sweeping events. Sometimes, quite genuinely, it's simply a whole nation cheerfully driving around together inside avocado green land yachts, fully convinced in that particular moment that they had truly never had it better. And maybe in their own strange and particular way, they honestly hadn't. Sleep well.